Welcome to Standing For Truth. My name is Donny B, and I am your host for this next session in our 2022 Defending Genesis Conference. I also have Matt with me as co-host to help me gather some questions for this important program. This is day 4, session 7, and the topic is Darwin's frauds, blunders, and forgeries. It is a privilege to once again have Dr. Jerry Bergman here with me. This is Dr. Bergman's 4th time here on Standing for Truth. His previous presentations are linked in the description box. I have a couple of his, what I would say to be must-read books here. The 3 Pillars of Evolution Demolished. And of course, the last show that we did specifically on C.S. Lewis, Anti-Darwinist. You'll be able to find links to those books in the description box as well. Now, before we get into the presentation, I do want to give my guest here a proper introduction. Dr. Jerry Bergman has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology for over 40 years at several colleges and universities, including Bowling Green State University, Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in experimental pathology, and the University of Toledo. He is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and 40 books and monographs. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he authored are in over 1,500 college libraries and 27 countries. So far, over 80,000 copies of the 40 books and monographs that he has authored or co-authored are in print. So again, it is a privilege to have Dr. Bergman here to speak at our 2022 Defending Genesis Conference. Jerry, I want to hand it over to you. If you had any words of introduction, of course, go ahead, and then we can get right into the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly good to be here. I am getting more and more used to Zoom-type conferences. Yes. I guess with the cost of gas and so on, especially in California, it's such where it's a reasonable solution is to simply do the Zoom-type contrast. But on the other hand, it's nice to be there and talk to people who are there. So I miss that as well, to be honest.
Right. There's pros and cons to both. Like you said, these days with the price of gas, it's nice to be able to do a presentation just right online over Zoom. So Jerry, whenever you're ready, I've got your screen shared, and we can get right into the presentation. As you get that ready, I will remind the audience, as always here with Dr. Bergman, we're going to have an audience question and answer session after his presentation. So please just make sure you're tagging me or Matt with your questions, and that way we won't miss them. Okay, Jerry, whenever you're ready.
Hey, sounds good. This is about evolution's blunders, frauds, and forgeries. And it's an interest I've had for many, many years. Not many people have this interest, but I try to look at the harm that Darwinism has done in society. And as I look into this, I'm finding more and more that it's done a huge amount of harm in our society. And this is one example of it. I can get this to work here now. And I should stress that what I am covering is not really controversial at all. It's simply history. And you can check my references. You can look at the things that I'm looking at to study. And therefore, you should be able to determine the phone is ringing. Oh, such is a life of phones. Anyways, so my research primarily in this area is just looking at printed material that was published 10, 50, 100 years ago. And it's only a small number of things I'm looking at now, and very briefly. I've written chapters, whole chapters on a number of these things. And by the way, I have another book coming out which has another 20 or 30 different blunders, frauds, and forgeries. So there's plenty of evidence out there. There are plenty of situations which I'd like to cover. I just find this very interesting, I guess, because I find history interesting. a lot of it is not controversial because you can look at what people said by reading their books. And this is my book, which covers that. And one of the main ones is the missing links, so to speak. And I will give a few examples. Missing links basically are links between humans and the theory is fish, that we evolved basically from fish. And on that account, just the other day, one day ago, I came across an article in New Scientist, and it's titled The Search for Ancestor X. And it says, the subheading, the identity of the species that gave rise to all humanity is one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. What? One of the biggest mysteries is our ancestor, and yet claims have been made over and over historically. In fact, that is an area I cover in my other book on apes as ancestors. And finally, an article here in New Scientist admits that the identity of the species that gave rise to all humanity, all of us, is one of the biggest mysteries in human evolution. Now, evolution is based on mutations. The problem with that is that we know the vast majority of mutations are harmful. And this is one example of a study done on mutations in fruit flies. And this is one of the earliest areas that we've looked at the effect of mutations, which is on fruit flies. No one is upset if we kill them. You can grow lots of them. In 2 or 3 days, you have several thousand. And so therefore, you can do a lot of research on mutations. So a lot of what we know, we've learned in studying fruit flies. And I should add, when I worked at the medical school, the area we worked at was cancer. And cancer, we know, is caused by mutations. And we know from studying mutations, and that's what I did at the medical school, we know from studying mutations that the vast majority are near neutral or harmful. Near neutral means they don't kill you, they're not lethal, but they add up, and you end up with death from the accumulation of mutations. Some are deleterious, some few are deleterious, but the vast majority are negative. And yet evolution is based on the accumulation of mutations. And this is a good example. Bathybius, Hecali, and Ezoan. These were 2 examples which they found in the ocean, and they were claimed to be the origin of all life. And you can see a picture, photograph actually of one on the left, and then on the right you can see a drawing of this Eozoan. Well, these were supposed to be the earliest forms of life, and they were studied quite intently, and they were serious. But, and of course, from these we have drawings of the life they evolved into, and these were done by Ernst Haeckel. And Ernst Haeckel, I might add, was an incredibly good artist. You can buy books of his drawings even today. So the problem wasn't his artistic ability. The problem was he saw in these things he found, which we know now what they are. They're nothing more than precipitates, but they're crystals, precipitates. He saw in these things the origin of all of this life, which evolved later. And there is Haeckel, you can see, as a young man, and then later on when he matured, you can see, was a professor in Germany, and he spent much of his life exploring the natural world. In fact, was very influential in helping people understand and accept evolution, including one man by the name of not only Charles Darwin, who influenced Haeckel actually, but Adolf Hitler. And we don't know that Adolf Hitler read or studied his work directly, but we know he was highly influenced by Ernst Haeckel. Pasteur later came along and disproved abiogenesis. And of course, that's what Haeckel believed in abiogenesis, that non-life can become life. And Pasteur is famous for his experiments where it was said if you put meat in a jar, doesn't take long, and you have maggots that appear on the meat, and then in time, those maggots become flies, and therefore this was an example of abiogenesis, life from non-life. Well, Pasteur found if you covered the meat, didn't happen. You had no spontaneous generation of flies or anything else. People said, well, when you cover it, you don't allow the life force to come into the bottle. Well, so he covered it then with cloth, which would allow, he claimed, the force, if there was such, to come in the bottle. And well, again, we find no maggots. And many other research studies were done to show indeed that there's no evidence of life coming from non-life. Well, Bathybius now was believed to be, as I mentioned, at one time the source of all organic life. It was a link between inorganic and organic. And eventually it was found to be mineral formations or precipitates. And here's an example. You have a solution, you add another solution, and then you have a precipitate, which comes out of solution and forms, in this case, at the bottom of the beaker. And that's what he found these were. Well, another more interesting case is Hesperopithecus. Hesperopithecus was an ape man based on a tooth. They found one tooth, and from that tooth, you can see the picture on the screen here, was the man they drew, who was the man where that tooth was from. And you can see the details they produced. The artist produced, by the way, a well-known artist did these drawings. And you can see behind him are horses and camels and other creatures. And not only Hesperopithecus, man was there, but his wife was behind him. You've got to have a couple there. And here then is the tooth which they used to develop the idea of Hesperopithecus. And they found it was the tooth of a peccary, a pig, an extinct pig. Now you might say, well, that's silly. How in the world would they not know the difference? Well, actually, the teeth of pigs are pretty close to the teeth of humans. And therefore, it's not quite as stupid as you might assume. And so they had good reason, they felt, to draw the ape man from only a few teeth. The other side, though, is that you probably need more than teeth, realizing that humans have teeth which do look like other creatures, and therefore you really need a lot more than teeth to determine that indeed you have a missing link. But of course, what they were looking for was a human link between man and the apes, and therefore they believe they saw it as a result of this. Well, this is an article you can see in Science magazine, and they are touting the finding of Hesperopithecus. And I should add that Science magazine is the most prestigious, the leading magazine of science in the entire world. And there you can see for the original teeth, again, shown with, you can see an article by Henry Fairfield Osborne, which basically detailed indeed why they believe this was a missing link. Well, another drawing you can see from a popular magazine from Canada. Basically, they're drawing the original. You can see up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see an example of, this phone keeps ringing. Maybe if I unplug it, it'll. Anyways, you can see a picture of the first life, which evolved, several hundred million years ago. And you can see the progression from the first life to the apex, which was man. And interestingly, they listed as one of the link a kangaroo. Number 19 was a kangaroo. And so you can see how this is based on a lot of guesses. And of course, they have no evidence of the missing links, the links between these, but what they are showing is all animals which exist today. Peccary, there's a peccary, in case you're curious as to what they look like. It's a large pig. It is a pig family, but on the other hand, it's a very different looking pig. There you can see a better picture of a peccary. They're still around today, by the way. Another attempt to prove evolution was, the belief was for about a century that inferior individuals, such as Negroes, they believe, now today we see this as absolutely ludicrous, but back then it was really why they believed that Negroes were inferior to humans, and that apes evolved into Negroes, which evolved into whites. And Darwin himself said very clearly that the Negroes would be in between apes and modern humans, and he felt that the inferior races, like the Negroes and the Australian people, Australian Aborigines, would eventually become extinct. Therefore, he said the gap between apes and humans would become wider. But for now, they're filled in the middle by this race of people. And the belief is that since Negroes were closer to apes than modern non-Negroid people were, therefore you can breed, they were expecting, a Negro and an ape. And so they called this in humanity. And Ivanovich was a scientist, a Russian scientist, and he attempted, in fact, quite a few times by artificial insemination to breed a human Negro, Homo sapiens intermediate. And the 20s, he carried on a number of experiments. Needless to say, he failed to achieve even a pregnancy. Well, today we understand in more detail why. But back then, and I should mention, Ivanovich was a internationally famous breeder of horses and other animals. So he knew his stuff. He was one of the best in the world to be able to breed quite a variety of hybrids from various other animals. And so if anyone is able to achieve this, it would be Ivanovich, Professor Ivanovich. But needless to say, he failed to achieve this goal. Interestingly, when he wanted to do this in a German colony in Africa, he asked the German government, and the German government said, no, you cannot do this, because this is back in the late 1900s, or early 1900s and late 1800s. And basically, they said that, no, this would be dehumanizing. And so back then we can see they had a lot of attitudes which we tragically saw them lose during World War II. But anyways, this failed, and there's a picture of the scientist, Ivanovich. And just in case readers are not familiar with the differences, I have a picture of a human and an ape. And as you can see, there were enormous differences between the two. But nonetheless, that was the theory for about a century. And Darwin accepted that, as well as many others, although they were wise enough not to specify the specific ape. But on the other hand, this was the idea. And they really literally felt this would be the future, because we could breed ape humans, and these could be used for soldiers in the army. And if they were killed, there would be less concern. And this is a picture of Stalin with one of these ape humans, which they were hoping to breed. And then these were pictures from Haeckel's book. Now you can see just by the pictures, we have clearly a chimp. This is in the German language, a chimp, a gorilla, an orangutan, and then a Negro. And you can see just by this picture what they are trying to say. And notice the drawings were distorted to some degree to make the orangutan look more like the Negro, which word I object to using, but on the other hand, this was used back then, and so I need to help readers and listeners understand how racist indeed they were. And this is a drawing found in a textbook by a University of Michigan professor, and you can see there's a female gorilla and then a female Hottentot. And it's interesting that these were both horrible distortions. Gorillas don't look like the picture, and female Hottentots don't look like the picture they drew. But they're drawing to help readers by looking at these pictures, which either they're somewhat similar. And I should mention, these pictures were in textbooks for years, and they convinced a lot of people that indeed certain races today are related to gorillas. Pithecanthropus Alice is another example. And this was again by by Haeckel, who basically was the great German apostle of Darwinism. Yeah, so that's what he was called. And he believed that man evolved from the apes and postulated as an antecedent form a creature physically halfway between the two. And there we go. So these drawings were made on the basis of a belief that out there somewhere is Pithecanthropus Alice. And of course, they never found it, but nonetheless, these drawings are interesting. When you look at them, you can see the distortion of what they were trying to do. And this P. Alice eventually diversified into 12 different species of humans that Haeckel believed made up the human races. And here's another picture of Pithecanthropus alus, and it's interesting how different they look. When you're drawing something based on a belief, you can see the artist puts a lot of his ideas into the drawing. And this is a good example of a hypothetical missing link, which indeed he hypothesized did exist. And this, by the way, this idea inspired a number of paleoanthropologists to go to Africa to look for the bones to support this missing link. And there I can show you the two pictures together. What a difference. And of course, this is a problem when you draw pictures based on a belief. Facial angle theory was another idea which was widely believed for many years. The idea is we can measure the angle of the face of creatures, and from this angle we can determine how evolved they were. And this is a good example of that. You can see they start out with fish, which have almost a horizontal angle, the facial angle, all the way up to humans, which have almost a vertical angle. And the most telling thing from this picture is this was used to measure different races, how evolved they were. And you can see this picture shows the modern Caucasian human, and then you can see 3 less evolved humans were less evolved, judging by the facial angle. And again, this idea turned out to be foolish, but it was believed for a long time. Another picture, there's a lot of pictures I have which show the same idea. Hitler used this in order to measure his perception of inferior races in Nazi Germany. Well, his scientists used it. And here's another example where you see 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and 5. So you can see these are different races which they hypothesized were inferior based on this facial angle idea. And then this led to the modern evolutionary progression. And we can see this parade is one of the most commonly pictured illustrations of evolution everywhere. There are thousands of examples of these. You see them everywhere. And this parade, although it's now realized, in fact, well, it was realized when it was drawn, that it's not true. It's false. That we don't have any of these missing links. We have basically the two extremes. We have modern man, and then we also have apes, and we really have virtually nothing in between. Another example, again by Haeckel. By the way, he was really a well-known, very important evolutionist. So he provided us with a lot of examples of forgeries. And this is an illustration of what he called the Embryo biogenic law, where he said that creatures began looking very similar in the earliest stages, and as time goes on, they look different and different. And you can see the pictures at the top look pretty similar. In the middle, they look less similar, and at the bottom, they look far less similar. And so this picture was used, this idea was used in textbooks in high schools and colleges for about a century, and it was seen as central evidence of evolution. The problem is many. One is these so-called pharyngeal grooves are not slits as he said they were, and they don't have a respiratory function. They're not gills or pre-gills. They're not gill slits as they were called. They're basically pouches which develop into other structures later on in the life of the embryo. And the human embryo doesn't have a tail. This was commonly taught for many years. You can see a somewhat what looks like a tail in the embryos, and this was taught as the precursor of the tail. And since humans had this, quote, tail, as did monkeys and other creatures, therefore this was seen as evidence for evolution. Well, what this is the first thing that develops in an organism is the nervous system. The nervous system has to coordinate all the other body parts. And so the brain develops first, which is obvious in this illustration, and then the spinal cord develops as well, very early in the development of the embryo. And you can see the brain and the spinal column, which is what the end of the tail is, the end of the spinal column. You can see that these indeed are very large, well, because they have to develop first. in order to have to coordinate, of course, the rest of the development. And a whole book written on this by Nick Hopwood, which I highly recommend, does an excellent job. It's about 500 pages, 8.5 by 11, but he really effectively demonstrates that this indeed was a set of frauds. And he named the book Haeckel's Embryos, which documents this. Now, today we know that at the beginning, yeah, there's similarities, but in between, which was Haeckel's first stage, they are already very, very dissimilar. And so they don't start out similar and become, as time goes on, more and more dissimilar. They start out fairly similar and then become fairly rapidly more dissimilar as time goes on. In fact, actually, you can see that the actual appearance is in the drawings shown here. And so indeed, Haeckel's drawings were very, very distorted. And back to the pictures I showed you that Haeckel drew, we can see that the problem was not his artistic lack. He was an incredibly good artist. He therefore clearly forged these drawings, and that's why we recognize them today as forgery. He was confronted with this fact, by the way, during his day, and he basically said, well, yeah, I forged them a little bit, but hey, it's a good point. If I have to forge drawings, which gets the idea across, the end result is good because I help people accept the fact of evolution. And now we can see Haeckel's fake drawings cut from his pictures. And then we can see photographs taken of the real embryos. And we can see, we're not talking about minor differences. We're talking about major forgery. And this illustrates this quite well. These drawings, by the way, were taken on the photographs from an electron microscope and other microscopic evaluations. And there we can see Haeckel's drawings, 1847, and then Michael Richardson's photographs, which were taken in 1997. So we can see, again, the enormous differences between the two. And there is Charles Darwin's cousin, Galton, and he originally developed fingerprints primarily to further support his eugenic goals. He felt you can identify people's race, especially inferior races, by their fingerprints. And this is really what he was trying to do. It's interesting because if they're an inferior race, you should be able to tell just by looking at them. I mean, just look at them and it should be obvious they're an inferior race, but you couldn't. And so he was trying to come up with a more scientific way of identifying inferior races. And we, of course, now use his research. You have the arch drawing, the loop drawing, and the world drawing. And this is part of the basis of fingerprints. Well, indeed, we know that his idea of fingerprints was very useful. And so that was very useful contribution to science. But his idea that you can identify races on the basis of fingerprints, now we realize is totally foolish. Another example is the Ancon sheep. And Ancon sheep basically were short-legged sheep, and you can see the one in the middle, which is short-legged. And the advantage of these sheep was sheep tend to be very independent. They wander, they do their own thing. And that's why you have to have a sheep herder, because otherwise they leave the fold and then you lose your sheep. And so you have to have fences to keep them within a small area, or you have to have a sheep herder to make sure that the sheep don't wander away. Now, many animals, you don't have to worry about that. Cows, they don't tend to wander away. You can keep them in one area without a problem. But sheep, they just run their own way, their own area on their own. So why would this be important? Well, you needed then shorter fences to keep the sheep in. So if you could breed some whole herd of Ancon sheep, you could then have short fences, which would save a lot of money, which therefore would allow you to keep your sheep in a smaller area, and you wouldn't have to spend so much money hiring sheep herders to keep track of your sheep. And Darwin was very excited about this. He talked about it in several places in his writing, and he basically said, here we have proof of, in one generation, mutations causing a new breed. End of story. We don't need to go beyond this evidence. And he discussed this, by the way, in 1859. And therefore, this was used for about a century as proof of evolution. And Darwin, as far as we know, is the first person to use this Ancon sheep idea as evidence for evolution. And here he mentioned, at least I know, 4 times in his writings. And I could mention that it was found that they were nothing more than a mutation, which does not produce an advantage. It produces a disadvantage. They basically have short limbs, as some people today, some certain people who are short have short limbs as a result of the same mutations. It's achondroplasia is the name of the disease. And these sheep were achondroplasic diseases, and it turned out they had all kinds of problems. And we realized this, by the way, in the 1930s. They did autopsies on them and realized that these sheep were a mess. They had all kinds of problems. And so therefore it never became a popular breed because, well, they had too many medical problems. The peacock feather is another example which Darwin used to support his idea of sexual selection. The problem then for Darwin was we have a lot of differences in animals and plants that are not survival differences. They don't help survival. In fact, in the case of the peacocks, they affect adversely survival because, imagine trying to escape a predator with this big tail, this colorful tail that would attract you to predators. It'd be hard to run away from predators. And so therefore, why in the world, Darwin asked himself, would these things evolve? And there's so many examples of differences between males and females, which are not, you can't explain, you can't support by selection. So he came up with a new idea called sexual selection. The idea of sexual selection was very simply that they weren't selected by natural selection, they were selected by mates. And so mates in this case would select the peacocks that had a more beautiful tail. And that's why they evolved the tail. Started out with a small tail, but through sexual selection, you ended up with a larger and larger tail. Well, now we know that this isn't quite so clear. There's many traits that the peahens used to select the peacock. One of them was not the tail. There are other factors as well. And so we know in many cases that sexual selection doesn't work because selection is based on many other things, that it's not going to cause these traits to develop. And an interesting study by Takahashi basically involved detailed observations of mating behavior, found the more colorful array does not give it a mating advantage, at least in many cases. And there you can see it was quite a fancy, colorful array. And there you can see the tail, when it's not displayed, is quite cumbersome to walk around trying to escape predators. Well, good luck. Another case here this is from the Museum of Natural History in New York. And we can see Java man at the far left, Piltdown man, Neander man, Cro-Magnon man, and modern man. And these pictures were found in not only museum displays, but also in many, many textbooks. I have quite a collection of these pictures or similar found in textbooks. Well, Java man, we now know it's a forehead which is distorted and probably a leg bone. There's like 4 bones total, and the leg bone is from a modern human. And Piltdown man, of course, is a forgery. Neanderthal man, we know it's just another race of people, just another people group. And so therefore, all of these so-called links from monkeys to modern humans have been disproved. Piltdown, one of the most famous, because that was accepted for 40 some years as a missing link. And you can see the white is actually what they found. The black is filled in, and therefore what was found was, it's the reverse. Black was originally what was found and the white was filled in. And you can see there's not much that was found. Now they did find parts of the jaw. And so therefore, way they drew this picture of the Piltdown man, as you can see in the illustrated London News, an example of the Piltdown Man. It's called Piltdown Man because it was found in Piltdown, which was a city in England. And this is another example of the reconstruction, which was used for decades. And you can see finally in the 50s, I believe, early 60s, it was proven to be a forgery. And this is an article about Brian Gardner, who was felt to be one of the forgers. Probably, though, the guy who found Dawson was probably the forger. But nonetheless, on the right, you can see an example of the fossil man of Sussex, and you can see drawings and a discussion of the importance of this individual. This was in books up to the early 1960s. And so it was hard to pinpoint a day when it finally was disproved beyond doubt, because a number of studies were done to disprove it, and it took some months. And you can see what was used, was a forgery of fragments from a human skull, you can see, and then you can see fragments were plaster, where white was plaster and the dark was, as I said, the original skull. And part of the chimpanzee skull was obtained from a chimpanzee, they think, which was from a zoo, and these were assembled together in such a way to where they looked like they belonged together. And one problem right away they should have noticed was where they're found. They were found in this area here. They were digging 2, 3, 4, 5 feet down, and they found the bones. The problem is that every year it rains, probably 2 or 3, 4 times a year, and fossils do not preserve well at all in a wet environment. And therefore, most fossils that are found in the dry area of Africa, which has been dry for centuries. And also they're typically found in rock, which protects them, or in areas where they can be protected from the elements. And so there's no way that bones would last for as long as they claim they did in this environment of soil, which is probably constantly wet. So they're not going to last. Java Man, we mentioned that earlier. And you can see the skull they found and the leg bones. The leg bones they think were from a human, and the skull bones, there's some debate about where they're from, but they're not from the original construction of Java Man. There's disagreement as to where they're from. But Java Man, you can see from the pictures here, was seen as a missing link, and the evidence was pretty difficult. Now we realize, because we've looked into more detail. That's the problems here. And here's a picture from a textbook, and you can see the ancestors. They show erect ape man of Java, Neanderthal man, a Negroid man, and then Nebraska man, and then modern man finally. And so you can see how these same illustrations were used for decades. Here's some of the Piltdown fossils they found. There is the jaw. I should remove that other picture, the first one. It's not very accurate. But anyways, you can see those are actually what they found. Part of the jaw, and you can see part of the skull. The occipital part looks like, and then some of the skull parts. Confucius Cernus, which was a name made up, of course. And this was a find touted as a missing link in National Geographic, and you can see a picture of what they found. And this was unearthed in China. It appeared to be a perfect museum quality fossil of a bird dinosaur transitional form. And so now we finally had proof, they felt, of the transition from dinosaurs into birds. And that's, of course, the common explanation of where birds came from. They evolved from dinosaurs. And then as they looked more carefully into this, and this didn't take too long to realize it was a forgery, when they looked more carefully, they realized that it was several parts were assembled together, actually not even very well assembled. The bottom layer was a shell backing, which was placed dozens of separate pieces of rock and bone they used to assemble the forgery. And there we go. That's an example. And this was featured in National Geographic, and they touted it as an important link between dinosaurs and modern birds. And this wasn't that long ago, and it was like months after this article appeared where they found indeed it was not what they thought it was a forgery. But actually, there are several researchers who knew it was a forgery before it appeared in the National Geographic. And there you can see the two front pages in article in National Geographic, and it's titled Feathers for T-Rex. And so this was basically seen as a true missing link in the complex chain that connects dinosaurs and birds. Well, they're too excited, too anxious, and that's why they ended up with this picture. And there is another example. Lots of these. And another picture, I should say. And this right here, they've identified now where the different parts came from. And this drawing done by Chris Rowe, who did a lot of the work on this, showed the top half was from a primitive bird, and then the bottom parts here were from a tiny dinosaur. The problem with fraud in science today is, according to one researcher, a serious and deeply rooted problem. It's especially a problem when you're looking at evolution because you have so many people looking for evidence for evolution that, well, here seems to be evidence. And it's easy to fool people who are incredulous, and really who want to be fooled. They want to believe. They want to believe that indeed this is finally evidence between, in this case, a dinosaur and a bird. And this belief there causes them to not look fully objectively at the evidence. And it's one study found researchers' propensity for self-delusion is strong, especially when examining ideas and data that impinge on their core belief structure. And therefore, we see what we want to see. And this is nowhere more evident than in the highly emotional field of evolution. Okay, how do we deal with this? Read. If you know a little bit about evolution, it's pretty acceptable. Believe it. Usually the way that you refute these naive beliefs that many of us, including me, had, is to read. And therefore, as you read more, you realize there are problems with so many of these claims that exist. And a good idea is natural selection. Natural selection is true, but it can only prune what exists. So what it does is reduces de-evolution. It doesn't cause evolution upwards from apes to modern man, but it reduces de-evolution. And we know that it's quite clear from my research on cancer at the medical school that that's the function that natural selection has. And the problem is neither Darwin nor anyone else has come up with a mechanism that produces significant levels of new variety required to move from bacteria to people. And that is a major problem. We need to have a mechanism which allows bacteria to evolve into people, and we don't have that. Darwin didn't. He admitted he didn't, and we don't have that today. And therefore, all efforts to prove evolution from molecules to man are a problem. Other reasons for fraud in science: money, tenure. Many people at the medical school where I was at, they're not really employed by the medical school. They get a grant. They're at the medical school because that grant pays for their salary and pays for their research. Well, if the research doesn't come up, doesn't work out right, what do? That grant's not renewed. And so, hey, if you're close to a discovery, which could be important, you might fudge the data slightly. It looks better. And then the grant's renewed and you'll have another 2 or 3 years of employment. And then hopefully you'll find more evidence that will prove what you're trying to. But on the other hand, it's really easy to stretch the truth to get the money for good reason because, hey, you need a job, you got a family, you don't want to move. A friend of mine was a professor at the medical school and his grant was not renewed. And he lost his job and he ended up having a problem. He took him 2 years, but he finally found another job doing research. But on the other hand, it was really traumatic. It was really difficult. He didn't have tenure. Many of these researchers don't. And so therefore, if you don't get your grant renewed, good luck. So Darwinists maintain the upper hand because they basically take an aggressive approach against unbelievers, which they consider those who reject evolution as unbelievers, and they ridicule us, they mark down grades, they deny tenure, they sack us if we manage to get a staff position. And so that is a problem. But at any rate, this is only a small chunk of the history of fraud and forgery in evolution.
Well, Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for another incredibly informative and thorough presentation. Again, I do want to recommend just a few of your books to the audience, because one thing about your books, Jerry, is they are incredibly thorough. This is another really good one, Fossil Forensics, where you go over just about every so-called line of evidence for evolution, including the fossil record, the so-called whale series, and actually a few of those are going to comprise the Q&A. So before I directly ask you any of those questions, I do want to hand it to my co-host Matt. Matt, I know you really enjoyed this presentation as well, brother. Did anything kind of particularly stand out to you? Any comments you want to make? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the evolutionary theory had to do with pushing racism up to the next level. Hitler even used it himself. I think in his book he used the German word for evolution like 140 times. So we can see kind of the trajectory that happened with humanity when we took on this idea of evolution over time, and how it's headed in a direction where the most evolved are the best, right? That was the Aryan race at the time. And a lot of people don't know history, and without knowing the history, we forget where evolution started and the direction that it was going. So it's a good reminder for people, I think, to see the history of evolution, and that it's not really scientifically based. It was more dogma that was pushed. So that's what I liked about it.
And there are a lot of references that point this out. In fact, David Duke, who was the head of the KKK for a number of years, he had a thick book, which, I don't know, 600 pages, I think it was, or 500 pages. And I thought, well, I'll learn a lot about David Duke and about all his ideas, and most of it's about evolution. And he spent chapter after chapter, basically, saying that he was a creationist, the young earth creationist. He went to college, University of Tennessee, and he studied evolution and basically became convinced that blacks were inferior. And he has, again, chapter after chapter, which covers this, showing how important this was in his becoming a head in his day of the KKK.
Interesting. I learned something new with fingerprints. I didn't know that they were using fingerprints to identify how evolved somebody was. That was unique.
That turned out to be a good discovery, though. That's useful today, but some of the ideas were so
yeah,
useful.
for criminals, absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, Matt, I'll give you the honors of asking the first question for our guest, Dr. Bergman here.
Sure. The first question came from Cram, and he was asking, were all those pictures and papers peer-reviewed during Haeckel's time, and why were they used so long?
Very, very good questions. Yeah, they were peer-reviewed. The problem is, Haeckel was by far the leading evolutionist and scientist in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's like me peer-reviewing Albert Einstein's work. It looks good to me. It's great. I think it must be true. So he really had a hard time finding peer review back then because there was not that many scientists. But yeah, he did work with his colleagues. I mean, his ideas were very influential, and other people he worked with accepted them by and large. But to some degree, that's a good point because, yeah, he was too much of a leader, and he didn't have enough critiques back in his day to look at these and say, now, wait a minute, there's a problem. And therefore, what was the second part of the question?
It's up on the screen right here. It is, why were they used for so long, and were they peer reviewed?
Oh, they were used for so long because they supported the belief back then. And so therefore, the problem is when you prove an idea wrong, you're going against the scientific establishment. And again, as I've had a number of scientists tell me, hey, yeah, we distort things every now and then, but the purpose is good. We're helping people understand the fact of evolution, and that is the end game, and that's important. And so therefore the means do justify the ends. And also once they become part of the textbooks, they tend to be passed on for years. Actually, Stephen Jay Gould did a really good job looking at this. He said, why do we have all these incorrect, these wrong ideas in textbooks? What's going on? And he did quite a bit of research on this and found basically that people who write textbooks tend to rely upon the textbooks they had when they were in college. And so I rely upon the textbooks when I write my own textbook, the ones that I had. The guy that wrote the textbooks that I had, he relied upon the guy who wrote the textbook he had. And so ideas that were popular in 1920 end up still in our textbooks in 1980 and 1990. And so therefore they're passed on without really critically thinking about them. And part of that is that people who write biology books typically are an expert in one area. And that's typically not evolution. And therefore they assume most of what is in their book is true because, well, they look at other books to get their ideas. And today most biologists have to specialize. They cover flatworms or some very specific area. And so if they write a textbook on biology, they have to rely upon other people. And so therefore you have a lot of ideas in textbooks that are still there. By the way, Haeckel's embryos ideas is still in the textbooks today, although they say, yeah, Haeckel forged some, but the idea is still true. And so they still have the same arguments in some of the textbooks today. Although I would hope in the near future, the argument totally would be removed because it's totally wrong. Very good question.
Well, the so-called major similarity, Dr. Bergman, that they still point to in debates today in 2022 is the so-called pharyngeal slits, these gill slits that they say end up developing in humans into breathing structures. But they'll say, the precursor to that, even in the human embryo, is our gill slits, pointing us back to our fish ancestors. What are your thoughts on that? What's a good way to counter an argument such as this?
Well, number one, anatomists have looked very carefully at this tissue, and they have nothing to do with gill slits. They have nothing to do with gills. They are not related at all in gills. And this idea, it's been around for a long time, and it's still every now and then it comes up. I've written several books on useless organs, vestigial organs. And I have friends and enemies that say, what are you writing this book for? Nobody accepts a vestigial organ argument. That's been refuted years ago. What are you writing this book for? Well, in doing some research, I basically did some on the internet, on new journals, new articles, and lo and behold, there they are. The vestigial organ argument is still used, still pushed. How long is it going to take before this is expunged from the literature? I don't know, but it's still there. And some of these, by the way, the vestigial organs were the plica semiluminarius, by the way, that was disproved in the 20s. And that's still around today. It was around solidly for up until the 80s. Finally, it's largely disappearing. But on the other hand, still around for 40, 50 years after it was disproved. And I found that by literature search. Some anatomist did research on it and did a very good article basically showing that this plica semiluminarius is not a nictitating membrane precursor as they believed, or remnant as it was once believed. And so therefore it's not true. And that was in the 20s. 23, I think, 24, that article was published. And so, it takes a long time before ideas are expunged from literature.
Right. That's a great point. What the evolutionists are saying now, Jerry, is, well, okay, there used to be 140 plus so-called useless organs and structures, but they may have function now, but they'll argue that it's simply because they've altered their function or they've co-opted a new function. So I've found, and I'm wondering if you found the same thing, they've actually revised the old definition of what a vestigial organ was.
Yeah, that's true. I've come across that. That's true. They do. And that's what they claim. But on the other hand, when you examine the beliefs, they still, like the nictitating membrane, did not evolve into a plica semiluminarius. There's no evidence of its evolution. So they claim, they still have a function, but it's not the function they believe they once had. And the best example is the appendix. Yeah, the appendix doesn't do what it used to do. It used to primarily digest plant material, but today it has another function. Yeah, but that's still a distortion of what they used to believe it did. And we know it has another function, but it didn't have the function they believed in the past. There's no evidence that the appendix, its function was primarily to develop, to break down and digest certain plant material. So
right. Great point.
True.
Great point. It's very similar to, and maybe you can speak a little bit on this, Jerry, the whole junk DNA paradigm, where the evolutionary community wants and still basically does assume that the vast majority of the genome represents evolutionary leftovers, genomic fossils, viral fossils. So it seems like it's now the vestigial organ argument being applied to the genome. If you could speak on that a little bit, Dr. Bergman.
Yeah, that's a common claim. But as time goes on, we're finding more and more. Now, several years ago, it was estimated 80% of these so-called useless genes were not useless. They had a function. And so again, they tend to argue, well, they had a different function in the past. But of course, that's conjecture. It's hard to demonstrate that. And it's true that some of the genome probably does not have any function. It's probably dead genes, as they say. But on the other hand, we're not talking about 90-some% or 80 or 50 or even 20, maybe 5% has no function. And so the argument as a whole has been largely demolished, even though there are probably some examples of part of the genome which doesn't have a function or doesn't today have a function. But of course, if that's the case, then that is not evolution, that's de-evolution, going the wrong way. Genes are becoming useless as a result of deterioration of the genome. And so that's probably true. So,
right, that's a great point. It's devolution, not evolution. It's not forward evolution. And you talked a bit about at the beginning of your presentation, Jerry, about mutations being, the so-called engine for evolutionary change. But you demonstrated that mutations, for the most part, are degrading, disease-causing, and deleterious. So isn't this more of a problem now for evolutionary theory? If most of the genome is junk, that means even more of these mutations are degrading to genetic functionality and the health of organisms over time.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. And when I speak on this in churches and schools, I point out that without a doubt, the vast majority of the genome has a function and it's useful. And the vast majority of mutations are problematic. And I point this out, and in fact, at university in Indiana, Wesleyan University in Indiana, I pointed this out to some of the people there, and they just look at you. And there's really no doubt, there's no question that the vast majority of mutations are harmful or near neutral, in the long run, thus harmful. And I mentioned, well, what's the other source for new genetic variety? And when I mentioned this at Indiana Wesleyan University, they looked at me, and yet, as far as I know, they're still teaching Darwinian evolution, even though they can't really respond to the problem I've raised. Now, some will say, well, we haven't figured out yet, but we'll figure out what the source of new genetic information is. But we'll figure it out, but it's not. It's
right,
not mutations.
And you mentioned that just now that the majority of them are nearly neutral or effectively neutral. So it's funny because I've found engaging evolutionists, including PhD evolutionary biologists, Dr. Bergman, that they'll say, well, sure, there are mutations that are degenerative, but natural selection will remove those from the equation. But isn't that the whole point of these deleterious mutations being nearly neutral? It's the fact that selection can't see them. They're invisible to selection. And so they are not removed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Near neutral doesn't mean they're not a problem. They just aren't an individual problem. They add up. In fact, we know aging is caused by the accumulation of near neutral mutations. And as we get older, they add up. And as we get older, we therefore end up with gray hair and wrinkles. They don't see as well as we used to, and so on. That's because the near neutral mutations are adding up, and eventually, when they add up to a certain point, then we end up, of course, dying. And that is what causes death, basically, is accumulation of near neutral mutations. If we could slow that mutation rate down, then, of course, we would live longer and live healthier. if we are exposed to certain things that cause a problem, like, for example, smoking or drinking or spending too much time in the sun, they cause aging because they cause mutations. Tobacco smoke causes mutations. The carcinogens in tobacco, it causes the problem because it causes mutations. Back when I was at the medical school, in order to research cancer, you have to have mice that have cancer. Well, mice generally don't have cancer. And therefore, you have to give them cancer. And you give them cancer by putting on their, we use breast cancer, we did skin cancer and breast cancer research. But you put NNK, which is a tobacco carcinogen, on that area of the body. And as a result, they end up developing cancer. And so therefore, we know from many other examples that cigarette smoking causes cancer as a result of mutations because they cause mutations.
That's a great point, Dr. Bergman. Before I move on to the next question, Matt, anything you want to add to that, brother?
That's my favorite subject. I'll just more be quiet. I love the talk about aging and senescent cells building up. What he was talking about in our lifetime, our body can't get rid of them. They add up. Literally everything you can point to, every cancer that they've literally traced to a mutation so far, what they thought before wasn't a mutation. It was just a product of the random environment. But now they're realizing, wait a minute, those carcinogens are actually causing the mutation, which is causing the cancer. And therefore, even dogs are getting the same type of cancer that humans are when they do the same things and live in the same places. So can't run from that one.
Good point.
So you wrote on this one recently, Dr. Bergman. I like to stay up on the article series that you put out on your website, which again is linked in the description box for people to check out. So this has to do again with mutations, but more specifically beneficial mutations, or so-called. And so the question is, did the Lenski research project with E. coli bacteria, I think they're now up to like 70,000 generations, maybe even more than that, demonstrate examples of mutations that add true novelty and complexity?
Well, that's debatable whether they add true novelty. One would not dogmatically state that every single mutation that ever exists in the whole world is negative. You know, there's certainly, every now and then I make a mistake, rarely, but make a mistake that's positive. And most all mistakes I've made in my life are not positive, but maybe I'll, the illustration is I'll put a decimal point in the wrong place in a check and I'll end up earning more money than I deserve. So that it does happen, but it's rare. And therefore, certainly there are mutations that can add information, but they're very, very rare. The Lenski experiment, which of course he's published books and several papers on that. But from my recollection, as far as I know, what happened is that you had loss mutation, which basically allowed another mechanism to be utilized. It's like you have a backup and then you destroy the main gene in front, and that allows the backup to express itself. And so I understand that in the Lenski experiment, and you're looking at a lot of generations, and we can see that basically it conforms to what creationists say, that by indeed you're not adding at least significant amounts of new novelty. What you have is still bacteria. You have bacteria, and I think they try to get bacteria to subsist on some other medium. And you have generally in bacteria, as well as many organisms, enough variety where it will switch over to being able to live off some other medium. And that's part of from my understanding, that's part of the built-in system which they have. It's like people, if we can't eat certain foods, we don't like them for some reason, and we're in an environment where all we have is that food, then we can adjust to, often, not always, but we can adjust to utilizing that food. And so what they found is really not earth-shattering. They haven't found that you have true novelty and at least significant levels of novelty. You may have some minor changes which allow certain reactions to take place that couldn't before that point.
Well, those are some great points. It's interesting because we had over the last couple of weeks a PhD evolutionary biologist who studied under Richard Lenski, and we had him on the channel for a discussion or a debate. And when it comes to this citrate utilization that they like to look to in terms of Lenski's E. coli bacteria, he did actually admit that this gene for citrate utilization could have already been present in the E. coli. And therefore, all we're getting and all that was observed was E. coli expressing a gene that was already present, but maybe turned off. Now it's being expressed under different conditions. So, when it comes to this problem of deleterious mutation accumulation, as you're pointing out, Dr. Bergman, one or two rare so-called beneficial mutations isn't really going to counterbalance the damage that's being done in all places throughout the genome. Is that right, Jerry?
Yeah, that's true. And what you mentioned on Lenski's research, that's what my understanding was. But you got to be careful in this area because I can't know everything about everything.
Right.
And I've read about Lenski's research. I'm aware of it, but I haven't worked with it beyond just reading what he did. And with bacteria, though, amazing that bacteria have incredible ability to adapt to a wide variety of environments. And again, this is built in. So, I mean, imagine if you're a bacteria and you're running out of certain kinds of food, you're not going to survive. And so therefore, bacteria have the ability, all microorganisms tend to have the ability to be able to adapt to a fairly wide, at least comparatively wide area of environments. And this is built in. And so E. coli is especially E. coli can adapt to a wide variety of environments. I mean, look where they thrive. They thrive in so many very different environments, including the intestinal tract, which not many organisms can. They can make it through the stomach. Some can, which is not very few bacteria can make it through the stomach acid, but E. coli can do so. And we know that when you're born without any bacteria at all. You're sterile. And then we know right away that bacteria begin to inhabit the intestinal tract of babies. And one study I read a long time ago said, you know how that enters? Through babies are so cute, we can't help but kiss them. And so you start kissing these babies, and the bacteria then kiss them on the cheek, the forehead, whatever. And the bacteria then take a trip into their mouth, into their stomach, and into their intestinal tract. And after 3 or 4 days, 5 or 6 days, you then have the bacteria thriving, E. coli bacteria thriving in their intestinal tract. So you go from a sterile bacteria to billions of bacteria within a matter of a few days. And these are things you remember when you study anatomy, that, some of the stuff you don't remember very well, but the idea that babies are cute and we kiss them and that's how they get this bacteria, and that's important. So don't neglect kissing a baby because that's important in getting the bacteria they need. And they, of course, have to have that bacteria in their system in order to thrive.
Right. Great points, Jerry. I appreciate that. Okay, here's the next question. Comes in from George Bond. And he says, a question for the doctor. Why do they still use horse evolution in museums?
Well, horse evolution has been used for so long. And the problem is that you have a variety of horses. And therefore, you can line them up. And so it looks kind of like you have this little dog-sized animal. And it evolved into this big horse. And that looks kind of like evolution. But of course, we have the dog-sized horses around today. And we have the big, in fact, we have some huge horses around today. And so you can line them up, and it looks pretty good. And therefore you can claim, well, this is evolution. We all love, and of course we are aware of horses. And therefore this illustration has been used in textbooks for a century. And therefore it works well, even though it's not quite as helpful as they thought. They realize now, though, basically we're not talking about evolution from a small to a big horse, but we're talking about basically the variety has changed, but yet the variety is still what we see in the dog. You could say that, well, dogs started out as a wolf, and now look at all the differences we have. Well, we have the same thing true in horses. Horses, they have a potential enormous amount of variety. Dogs have a potential for enormous amount of variety. Cats have a potential for enormous amount of variety. Many animals don't. Many animals, there's just very limited variety. Even with purposely breeding, we just don't get much variety. Where some animals you do, and therefore they fit the scenario. And besides that, again, you're trying to convince somebody of the truth of evolution, and therefore, hey, it works. And yeah, it's fudging the data a little bit, but we're not worried about it. Now the problem is we don't have a neat evolution from a primitive dinky horse, dog-like horse, to a full-grown large horse. We have lots of different horses, and now it's hard to figure out the evolution because what we have in the horse family tree is lots of different horses, and to try to go from one to a modern horse is problematic. And so that more data has really shown that to be a problem.
Right.
All right. Here's a question. This is about the Paracas elongated skulls in South America that we find. I'm sure there are other places in the world probably as well, but that's what comes to my mind is the South American elongated skulls. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I'm wondering if this isn't helped by some binding when the person is young, like they put the rings in the neck and you can get longer necks. And the skull, of course, does have some malleability, and so therefore they can be, through cultural practices, the shape can be affected. And the reality is, in people in this country, if you lined up a couple million people, you're going to find a few people that have elongated skull. It's that in certain parts of the world, they valued that, and therefore they may, Darwin might have been right relative to sexual selection. So if a woman had a long skull, then she was desirable, and so therefore you could hopefully pass that trait on to your kids. So these things that are valued are more apt to be reproduced ideally, and so therefore to some degree there's some flexibility. And of course the idea is if a woman is attractive, she's more likely to get married and have kids, etc. So to some degree Darwin is correct, but on the other hand, I don't mean to say any kind of words about anybody, but sometimes when you look at couples, you wonder, what did he see in her? Or what did she see in him? And you wonder, why in the world, I've had friends and you have too, why in the world would she, attractive young lady, why in the world would she marry this guy? I don't understand it. Well, he has a nice personality, so get around it that way. On the other hand, I would think there's some validity in Darwin's idea of sexual selection. And this might be true on the head shape and some other physical traits that we see are common among certain tribes, certain peoples.
All right. Appreciate that answer, Jerry. Next question comes in from Paleologos, and he says, question for Dr. Bergman. Shouldn't we expect some vestigial structures to have arisen as a result of degradation since the fall?
Yeah, that's a good point, and probably not vestigial, but probably, yes, less useful and therefore not developed. And that is many examples of that. And I think one good example is vision or certain skills that we learn. Language is probably the best example. Most of us really have vestigial language structures because we didn't learn many languages when we're young. One of my granddaughters, her mother is Hispanic and father is English, and therefore she was reared in fluent Spanish, and when she's around her mother, she speaks Spanish. When she's around her father, she speaks English. And so therefore you have a young lady that is fully, completely fluent in Spanish with no accent and completely fluent in English with no accent. And so that's a good example of the fact that we have a language ability, which if it's developed when we're young, we can then be fluent in many different languages. But if we wait too long, then it's hard to learn languages. I learned this in German. To get my doctorate, I had to learn 2 languages. And one language I picked was German. And I had a harder time with learning German than I did with learning the material for my doctorate degree. And so I really had to struggle with learning German. I had to take courses and classes and worked on it, and I really had a hard time learning German. And I had some native German speakers help me, and they couldn't understand why I can't say certain words. Well, just never practiced. The umula, for example, is dead in my mouth. It's not used because English doesn't use that. German does, Spanish does, many languages do. So therefore, to some degree, the uvula for humans, for many of us, is vestigial because of our not using it when we're growing up. And likewise, because of the degeneration, I'm sure we're not as active as we used to be, and therefore some muscles are vestigial because they're not used, and so on. So that's a good point. You've got some really bright, intelligent, perceptive listeners. It's nice to know. Sometimes I don't get that when I do a show. I wonder what's wrong with the listeners, but so far all the questioners are really good. So you must be proud of the quality of your listeners.
Well, we're doing our best to train them, Dr. Bergman, and
Okay.
it's a blessing having, highly knowledgeable individuals like yourself on the show to help us out. Matt, I know you wanted to add something to that too. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, the Australian Aboriginals are actually a great answer to that question as well, because we see that the wisdom teeth are now not being produced when they're born in the next generation after modern diet is introduced to them, because their jaws are shrinking in size, their teeth aren't fitting in their mouth, and what's happening is the children are being born without the production of any wisdom teeth. So now wisdom teeth are being considered vestigial elements of the human body, even though they serve a function when your teeth fit in your mouth. When they no longer do fit, they are actually now being considered vestigial. So it's a perfect example of how fast something like that can actually happen.
Oh, good point.
All right. Appreciate that input there, Matt. Okay. Next question comes in from Taylor K. We got a lot of questions, Jerry. You're a fan favorite. So Taylor asks, what are all of the unproven changes that a dinosaur must have gone through to become a bird? Example, feathers, hollow bones, beaks.
Oh, that's a really good question. One of my favorites is the lung system. The lung system of birds is very, very different than the lung system of dinosaurs. Totally different system. And not only the lung system, but the heart is designed very differently. And of course, the hollow bones and beaks and feathers and so on are the more obvious ones. But there are many examples besides these three. In fact, in so many ways, birds are a whole different creature. Well, that's pretty obvious looking at them than our dinosaurs. And so the reason they select dinosaurs as the ancestor of birds is, do you have a better choice? I mean, all the life that's around there, if you're trying to hypothesize where birds evolved from, really, do you have a better choice? So they take the best choice they can find, and that is dinosaurs, which is a bad choice, but it's the best choice they can find. The early example, I was talking about attractiveness, and I have asked this to people, and some women who married guys that you just would not think they would be attracted to. And they said, well, there's only so many guys out there, and I can't be too fussy, and therefore it's just he's the best choice of the choices I had. And therefore, yeah, he's has things that he's not good at, but on the other hand, of the choices I had, he was the best choice. And so therefore, he's a good man, he's a good husband, but on the other hand, you're right. It's just what can a girl do? There's just not that many good choices. There's not that many good men out there, especially, by the way, I should add, after World War II, when 20 million young men in Germany lost their lives during the war. So many of the women, they didn't have a choice because there wasn't many men around, and so they married Americans. And this is an area of interest of mine because I know quite a few German girls, women who married German guys. When I was younger, I knew. And I asked him, why would you marry an American? He was the enemy. And this one woman told me, yeah, that's what my mother said. These guys, Americans come there and bomb most of our cities, kill most of our people, destroy us. And now my daughter's going to marry one? How could you marry an American? They're the enemy. And she said very simply, what choice do I have? I mean, it's not like there's a lot of German guys walking around my age that are marriageable. So I don't have much choice. And by the way, this one woman I'm referring to, she said he was a good man. And my mother didn't agree with me at all in marrying this American guy and leaving Germany. But on the other hand, it was at that point, I just had no choice. But on the other hand, I moved to America and they was well accepted. And I had a good husband, I had a good marriage, so I don't regret it for a day. But on the other hand, when I was in Germany, well, I'll tell you, I had people who wanted to hang me. You're marrying one of these bad Americans? And same is true on the other side, of course. Some German girls married Russians. And so they married the enemy. And by the way, in Japan, China, the same thing. I know a number of girls in Japan who married Americans because so many Americans, so many Japanese men were murdered or killed. So anyway, so when you look at the best example, the best possible example, dinosaur. A bad example, but the best among the choices.
Great points. Very interesting points. I guess there wasn't a huge variety in terms of selection immediately after creation and also after the flood either, where you've got 8 people repopulating the earth, which actually brings a question to mind. I'm curious as to your thoughts. We constantly get challenged by the critics by saying, biblical creation can't be true because you've got Adam and Eve at creation, 2 people. And then after the flood, you have 8 people, Noah, his wife, and, their sons and wives, of course. So they'll say there's an inbreeding problem. And because of this, that population would have been driven to extinction. What's a good way to respond to that, Jerry?
Well, the mutational load we know is increasing. And back then with Adam and Eve, and of course for several 100 years, even 1,000 years, mutational load isn't going to be that large. And so therefore, marriage between relatives was common and wasn't a problem because the mutational load was very small. And of course, going back, of course, the main question, who did Adam and Eve's children marry? Who did Abel marry? Or the other children? Probably, the Bible doesn't say much about Adam and Eve's children, but other sources, and there are a number of other sources which claim they had 15, 16, 17 children. And so the age of these could be quite different. And so their son may go out to land, several hundred miles away and meet his sister, who he's never seen in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years. And he know, this is my sister. I know it's my sister, but on the other hand, it's a stranger. And so therefore you didn't have the issue which we have in families where you have a brother and sister that are a year, 2, 3 years apart. And that would be, of course, today we talk about marrying your sister, that would be an issue. But back then it wasn't necessarily an issue because if you're going to live to be 900 and some years, 20, 30 years, and Eve may have had a child and then 10 years later, another child, and then 10 years later, another child. And so they're probably spaced out quite a bit. And so therefore finding a mate was not that difficult, even though at first, of course, everyone alive on the earth would be children of Adam and Eve. So that would, and the mutational load, of course, is the big issue.
That's a great point.
Today, why do they condemn marriage between brother and sister or close relatives? Because mutational load. That's the reason. And so that's acknowledged as the reason.
That's right. That's right. Great response. Inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. So at creation, there were no genetic mistakes. So I don't understand how there would be an inbreeding problem. So that's a perfect answer, Dr. Bergman. So here's a question that comes in from Slam RN. Thank you for the question. So the questioner asks, I have been hearing, I've got it up on screen, from some good scientists, anthropologists, that Homo heidelbergensis is not a real species classification, but is made up of fossils from other species. And it looks like they're just wondering what your opinion is on that, Dr. Bergman.
That's a good point, because when we assemble the bones to make a species or make one person, ideally, generally you find them scattered, they're fragments, they're in various locations. And Lucy, I understand, some of the bones many were in a small area, but some of the bones were 30, 40, 50 feet away. And a lot of these bones, it seems they were persons that died and their carcass was scavenged by hyenas or other animals that basically scatter the bones. And so therefore, because you only have fragments, it's very hard to say this and this other bone fit together. And if they fit together quite well, then that they may indeed fit together. But on the other hand, so many of these bones do not fit together, and therefore you have to assume that they're different parts. But of course, when you're trying to find the missing link and you're trying to make a name for yourself and you're trying to get grants from National Geographic, you've got to have some evidence. And so therefore, we're not clearly certain that all these bones are part of one individual, but hey, we got to live. We got to get a grant, and National Geographic isn't going to give us the money unless we have some at least good indications that we're finding something useful. And so therefore, we'll just assume they're part of the same individual, and they may not be part of the same individual, but they may be part of several individuals of the same species. They may be brother and sister or family. and therefore to fit them together is not that much of a problem. And what else do we have? In fact, the vast majority of so-called missing links are primarily the skull bones, and that's it. They're the skull. And so all we have is the skull, or parts of the skull, and the jawbone, and so on. We don't really have any other bones, so therefore we do the best we can.
Those are some great points. Yeah, the fossil records, low quality, low confidence, especially when compared to fields like genetics, where we can directly answer this question of ancestry. I might not get this perfectly right, but I remember reading a while ago, I think it was a form of Tyrannosaurus, maybe Eutyrannus, but they discovered that where they were labeling new species, it actually turned out it was one species, one creature, but in different stages of its life. So just changes in morphology in its life they were looking at. And because of those differences, they were saying, okay, these are different species, and then realize, oops, this is just one species. So, I mean, right there's the types of, outcomes that you'll get from the fossil record. So, okay, Jerry, as always, time flies by with you. We're at the 1.5 hour mark. So I'll get one final question in here for you. And then we'll wrap it up. So I always appreciate your time, Dr. Bergman. And I know you've written on this one as well. As a matter of fact, you and I spoke on this, I think, a few shows ago. And so the question is the so-called chromosome 2 fusion, and Matt, you and I know the evolutionists like to bring this one up frequently these days. Hey, puppy.
He's a visitor. He's watched it.
Yeah. I hope he's a young Earth creationist. If not, he'll be converted after this presentation.
Yeah, he's a young puppy.
We can get him to answer this question if you'd like. So yeah. So anyways, I've got it up on screen. It has to do with the chromosome 2 fusion. And to I guess lay out some context, I would say this is a blunder too, because the evolutionists, weren't really expecting humans to have 46 chromosomes. The great apes have 48. And so, they hypothesize a possible chromosome 2 fusion that evolutionists are still holding up as good evidence for human evolution. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Bergman?
Yeah, that's another good example of a blunder, because you expect in the fusion, you expect to find 2 centromeres and a telomere at each end, plus a fusion point where you have the 2 telomeres that fused. And you don't find that. You don't find 2 centromeres, and you don't find what you need. Now, there's some genes that are similar to a telomere, pronounced different ways, by the way. I like telomere because the word telescope is tele, which is what we're looking at. But anyways, the 2 telomeres in the center, you find a couple of genes which indicate that, but by and large, what they found is a couple of base pairs, I should say. What they have found basically is there's actually genes in this area that they're supposed to be telomeres. And so this turned out to be totally wrong. And I think that just ignore it today, because many evolutionists realize it's a mistake. And so therefore, the best way is just ignore it. Don't talk about it.
Right.
But on the other hand, creationists have done a good job, because if you understand the tools necessary to analyze the genome, a lot of this is online, and you can use the tools to do the analysis. And you can find, for example, genes that have other functions. And therefore, that's what colleagues I work with did. They now analyze very carefully this fusion point where it's supposed to have fused at, as well as the centromeres, and found there's just no evidence for it. It's just simply untrue.
Amen. Well said. As you put it, we've got another blunder here. They don't really like to talk about it. I think it was Dr. Ken Miller, who's an evolutionist, who said if there was no fusion, there was no evolution. That's how confident he is in it. Well, sorry to say, there was no fusion, so I guess there was no evolution. I like to say you don't get highly functional genes by slamming together 2 chromosomes. And, that so-called fusion site, as you're pointed out, and Dr. Tompkins has done great work on, looks to be an active promoter inside that DDX11L2 gene. So great response, Jerry. Time always flies by with you. Matt, thank you for joining as co-host. To the audience, thank you so much for so many great questions. And Jerry, I want to kind of hand it over to you if you had any final words, final thoughts. And thanks again for being willing to come on the show and give us so much great information.
Yeah, just a final thought, and that is, some people when I talk about this, they say, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, if we evolved or God created us, I mean, in the end, we have the same thing. But it indeed does matter. And I'll give you a good example. I'm involved in a Methodist church, and they're going through a split now. And we had a local pastor who did a really good job trying to analyze what the whole split was about. And the whole split basically is about the fact that so many of the Methodist pastors, and especially the hierarchy in the church, does not accept the creation of Adam and Eve. They accept evolution. And so at its core, the problem is the split, which is causing the split. At its core, the problem is Genesis valid? Is the Bible valid? And the problem is evolution, because if evolution is true, the Bible's not valid, not the infallible word of God. If evolution is not true, then that impediment is not there to get in the way of accepting the Bible as God's word. Before, of course, Darwin, it was almost universally accepted the Bible as God's word. In fact, some years after Darwin. But as evolution infiltrated the seminaries, especially Methodist seminaries, as evolution infiltrated the seminaries, what happened was it was widely accepted. Therefore, the Bible could not be infallible, because the Bible talks about our origin is from Adam and Eve, not from some ape ancestor. And therefore, this idea of evolution is the foundation of what we see now going on in the split in the Methodist Church, as well as other churches are going through the same thing. The Methodist Church is more severe for a number of reasons. But anyways, that's an issue which is totally unnecessary. And I'm wondering, why doesn't somebody get into those seminaries and help them understand? Just bring this new magazine, which I just got 2 days ago. Bring that magazine and read them, what they found. So Amen. It's not hidden. It's there. It's there. You just have to look for it. And therefore, somebody needs to go into the seminary and say, hey, this is what the facts say. But of course, they're not doing that. So,
Amen. Well said. Yeah, you said it perfectly, Jerry. I completely agree with every single word. And the information is out there, and there is a lot of information. Just alone in your, 3 books I'm holding up right here, there's enough to completely overturn evolutionary theory. So, okay, Jerry, I really appreciate your time. It was nice meeting your dog there.
Yeah, and he just took off with something. He needs to evolve more.
Yeah,
he needs to learn you don't steal things that are belonging to somebody else.
Amen, brother. Okay, well, thanks again for tuning in. This was session 7 of our Defending Genesis conference. To the audience, we will be back here with Professor David McQueen and George Bond in about 45 minutes for session 8, focusing on the flood. So with that being said, God bless everybody, and Standing for Truth is out. We are live here. Welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny B, and I am your host for this next session in our 2022 Defending Genesis conference. I have Professor David McQueen and George Bond, my amazing flood researchers for the Standing for Truth team. This is day 4, session 8. We have now roughly 14 plus hours worth of conference content on all sorts of topics related to the creation versus evolution controversy. The topic for this session, session 8, is amazing evidence for the worldwide flood. Both George and David, of course, have done a ton of research on this topic, and I am very much looking forward to this. Professor David McQueen, good to have you here, brother. I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm loving the Batman there.
So it's so good to be back with George. I always enjoy the first 5 minutes that we can be lighthearted about Batman and Robin and so forth. George, I got these for you. Halloween's coming up, and the animals in Australia maybe they even dress up. I am not clear about that.
I've got some wisdom for you too, David. Did you know the early bird catches the worm? You're aware of that?
I've heard that.
But did you know? But the second mouse gets the cheese.
Ah, second mouse. That's true. And here's my joke for you, my friend. I've been a bit under the weather and just walking around the neighborhood and carrying my Batman head. And what I've discovered is some people don't like me. George, I was walking down the road and I was hit by a violin, a cello, and a bassoon. What am I to assume? Well, I think it was an orchestrated attack.
All right.
Sounds like it to me, Professor
So
McQueen. I
much
appreciate
for that humor there. George and I have spoken for the last 2 weeks about how we want to proceed. I am going to give a 20-minute overview of what I consider the 5 best evidences for the worldwide flood. I'm going to limit myself to 20 minutes, turn it over to George for 20 minutes, and then Donnie, if you could alert us when we get to the 40-minute break. We want to take some Q&A before we go to the 1-hour break. I will ask you and George to cover for me then. In this bout of sickness I've had, my tastes have changed, George. I have switched from coffee to very strong black tea. So I'll get some of that with your permission when the time comes. Okay, George?
No worries. Just keep in mind too that I have to head off. I've got a lunch appointment. So
Okay, good.
we're going to try and cover all that that information we've got in that short time we've got. So
okay, good.
let's get cracking.
George, it better,
Let's get
George,
going
it better
here.
be pizza you're having for lunch.
Oh, definitely.
Today.
Yep, definitely
I had
with
a feeling,
pineapple.
I had a feeling. You're the
With
pizza man.
pineapple.
It's
Okay.
pineapple pizza.
Donnie, if you'll help me out and tell me when I have 5 minutes left of my 20. George and Donnie have encouraged me to move into the 21st century. So I actually want to share my screen for the first time. Let me see if I can follow the steps that I have been taught. I guess I asked Donnie, can I share my screen?
Absolutely. Professor McQueen. So if you remember, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see all the options: mute, stop cam, settings, and share. So make sure to.
Okay, I'll click share here.
And then you'll
First
get a
time
few
you
other
got
options. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just make sure to click the share screen option.
Share screen option.
And then it should say choose what to share. And you're going to want to share the entire screen. And you're going to want to make sure to click the box that's right in the middle there. And then you'll be able to click the share button.
Okay, good. I'm clicking the entire screen. And I want to share. And what I do is now I bring up my PowerPoint, right?
There it is. Professor McQueen, you are an expert already. Good job.
Okay, no, I'm not, but I'll try this. Here's my PowerPoint presentation. And I guess I make it full screen just like I always do by pressing this.
Yes.
Maybe?
Yep.
Okay, and then I'll click through it. Here are the 5 evidences, best evidences, that a young Earth worldwide flood is the correct model. And it certainly can be seen in the Grand Canyon. Okay, now let me go up here and start my slideshow, which I guess I do that way. And I start it from the beginning. Now, am I moving into the 21st century here? I hope I am.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
And so now my screen is going blank because it's sharing my screen.
It looks like it's just loading.
Oh, it's
currently.
loading it up. Okay.
Yeah, I can see the
old computer here. So I'll go through the 5 things and I'll show you the 5 things. 5 best arguments are these: persistent strata such as what we see in the Grand Canyon here. If, whoops, pressed the wrong button apparently. I don't know what I did wrong. Strange.
No worries, Professor McQueen. You're still shared. So if you just go
Okay,
back to your
good.
PowerPoint,
Okay, let me go back to my PowerPoint, which should be,
unless you accidentally exited out of it, I'm not too sure.
I must
You-
have.
you may.
Listen, I will continue to play with this. I'm going to stop sharing and do it the old-fashioned way here. So here are the points, the 5 proofs for the true geology of the worldwide flood. The first one is the persistent strata that we see at the Grand Canyon. As we've commented, George and I, over the last year, if you look at the lowermost strata in the Grand Canyon, called the Salk sequence, illustrated by this blue Play-Doh here, it turns out that you can find that Salk sequence all over America. The Tepete sandstone equivalent in the southern Appalachian Mountains is called the Rome Formation, and it's got a little bit of a look of this red that you see here. I'm going to tell you how that red will trick you in a minute. And so the first point is, how can you explain, in an evolutionary geology point of view, how you can get persistent rocks all over the continent? The second point is the dominance of marine fossils. Donnie, if you and George visit me in the years to come, we'll rendezvous in Cincinnati, go see Ken Ham's Ark and the rest of the museum and so forth. And if we go there, we'll be able to find fossil-bearing rocks. Now, it turns out a U.S. dollar bill is 6 inches, to give you a sense of the scale here. You can find, this is a Ordovician or Salk sequence stromatolite there. An example of marine fossils. Well, the marine fossils that are found all over the earth are a group of clams and snails and brachiopods. If we go to Cincinnati and we go near the Ohio River, George, we'll be able to see brachiopods there. Clams and snails we all should be familiar with from taking our families to the beach. A clam is a pelesiopod. A snail is a gastropod. The rocks that are at the Cincinnati area are so famous, they're given their own series. They're called the Cincinnatian series, and they're found worldwide. Since the worldwide flood is true, we would expect that marine creatures would be buried in the rock record before mammals, dinosaurs, and man. And so this is consistent with our flood model. The third argument that I would give to our audience tonight is chalk. White Cliffs of Dover. I think we've all seen images of the White Cliffs of Dover as the years have gone on. And that same white chalk that consists of microfossils is found in Texas. It's called the Austin chalk. The White Cliffs of Dover, I must admit, Grandfather McQueen and my own dad might not appreciate this, but the Queen died today. Traditionally, you're supposed to say, the Queen is dead, long live the King. Tremendous respect for her World War II service. So the White Cliffs of Dover, when you go across into Europe proper, you find it. And as we've talked about Derek Auger in the past, he found it on the north shore, on the north coast, rather, of Turkey. So these are microfossils and it shows that we have worldwide rock types, perfectly consistent with the worldwide flood. Now, if you imagine this rock here to be a map instead of a rock, let's travel to the Bahamas. If we go to the Bahamas, go to the Andros Island there in the Bahamas, you and George and I, Donnie, can walk out on micrite mud. Now, why would a carbonate like that be such an important argument tonight? In previous videos, George and I pointed out that limestone is simply not a problem. It's not a problem to have a group of chemicals. For example, here's an antacid tablet that is calcium carbonate, you'll see there. You mix that with water at a certain pH, temperature, partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of or a certain amount of CO2, and you can directly precipitate from the ocean of Noah's day limestones. And so the arguments that many have given, George and I, in the last year, oh, McQueen, oh, George, you can't get limestones. It has to be a long time. That's simply not true. My final argument, and I'll use my, I keep my markers in a can of primordial soup. Donnie, you don't think that something may begin to evolve and crawl out of my primordial soup, do you?
There's always a chance.
There's always
in the mind
a
of the
chance.
evolution.
Well, it's an empty can.
If you wait long enough, it will.
Oh, that's right. Time is our big answer, isn't it?
Yep.
So imagine that we put this can down in the ground in the western United States. So you walk up upon it, let me get it turned right, and you look down at the famous Bingham copper mine. This open pit mine in the western United States consists of copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver. It's an amazing mine. Now, I saw it when it was active back in the 60s and the 70s. Sadly now, through some governmental mismanagement, sadly, it has filled in with water and has actually become an enormous toxic waste issue. But let's go back to the days when it was just a hole in the ground. All of you that are watching this that might be in the Green Party or concerned about the environment and the pollution of metals that come out of mines and so forth, let me suggest to you that if you go to an open pit mine to protest, be sure that you ride a horse. Because if you take a Mercedes-Benz or you take a Chevy to this open pit mine, you're being a hypocrite, because you could not have all that without the metal. Couldn't have a car, couldn't have a plane to get there. So as you go worldwide, I want to assure you that whether you're in Australia or Africa, these 5 points provide a valuable argument. How close am I to my mark, Donnie?
Good question. You are at 8 minutes, Professor McQueen.
8 minutes? Okay. Well, then I've got a few more minutes to talk about. The argument that George and I have made over the last year is that when you look at the stratigraphic record, the fossils that are in it appear abruptly and fully formed. And so if you go to a place like the Grand Canyon and look for a trilobite, and you'll notice I've poked a hole in my Play-Doh here. I think you can see it there. Let's imagine that to be a fossil. That fossil would not just lie about for 10,000 years before it got covered by another rock unit and fossilized. No, not at all. The clams and the snails that we talked about earlier, if you've been to a beach and actually seen the seashells there, you never find, never, on a modern beach, you find the shells popped open. Why? Because the biological part that holds the clamshell together rots very quickly, and then the shell pops open. Only if you see catastrophic burial do you find, only if you find catastrophic burial do you find whole clams and whole brachiopods and other bivalves in that environment. And so when we look at these 5 points, I'll go over them one more time. The persistence of strata, like at the Grand Canyon, the tapetes, the coconino, can be found all over North America. How does the evolutionary community explain that marine fossils dominate in essentially Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian even? You pick up some fish fossils there. But let's stick to the Cambro-Ordovician, the Salk sequence. How come they dominate there? I would argue because they were first captured by the worldwide flood. The chalk deposits in England, Austin, Texas, the North Shore of Turkey, these kind of chalk deposits are not a problem for young Earth creationists, but rather they're a problem for the evolutionary community, because how come we should have worldwide rock types that are easily identifiable as we travel the globe? When we go to a place like the Bahamas, we can see a modern laboratory illustrating the rapid formation from seawater of carbonates. And then finally, when we go to look to explain ore deposits, we see an evidence of God's grace. The large copper deposits in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that I've spoken about in the past, let's return there. The descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as they moved around the earth, migrated. They came across the Canadian Rockies, and they ended up in what we would call the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And as they were walking around, one of the teenagers ran ahead, fell down, and cut his knee on a copper deposit sticking up out of the ground. And so it was by God's grace that the Native Americans found these copper deposits. Then when the Cornish miners came over to America and were in Michigan, they began working mines on the old Native American area and discovered the copper that became the standard for the American copper industry and also worldwide. I think George could look up in his old electrical engineering books the resistivity of copper, and he'd probably find a column there for native copper. Any questions from Donnie or George? I'm ready to turn it over to him now.
Very good, Professor McQueen. Great timing. Fantastic lines of evidence presented. I do appreciate that. We got 50 people in the chat enjoying this so far. I do want to remind anybody who's just joining us, this is session 8, day 4 of our 2022 Defending Genesis conference. The topic of this specific session is amazing evidence for the worldwide flood. Please tag me with your questions. I do have some already. but I'll save that for the audience question and answer portion, Professor McQueen.
And George, with your permission, I'm going to have him drop my video and go get some hot tea.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good job, David and George.
No
You
problems.
award-winning co-host, you.
I'm going to share my screen, Donny, because I've got a lot to show, but I don't know whether we'll go through it all in the time that we've got.
George, I want to point out, with how much research you've done and the evidence that you're about to provide, we are definitely going to be getting some what?
Pizza.
No. Have a look at the camera.
Oh, sorry, I'm into my evolution tears. Yeah,
evolutionist tears. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice fresh cup of evolutionist tears. So here we go, George. You are shared. You're good to go, brother. And don't make them uniformitarians cry too much.
Okay, so I'd like to start off by saying, may the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light, your ears to the truth, and your heart to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, what we're going to go through today, there's a lot. I mean, I've heard evolutionists, they say categorically, right? They say there is no evidence for a worldwide flood. I don't know whether they're blind or stupid or whatever, but you only have to go outside to have a look. There's a thing called sedimentary layers, but let's go through anyway. In Genesis 7.1, and the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Now, at Standing For Truth, we're here, and our main mission statement is defending the truth of biblical creation. And biblical creation is in Genesis, right? I always say, if you can't support the foundation, then there's no point. That's why I laugh at these theistic evolutionists who question Genesis. They try and insert all sorts of ideas about gaps, etc., to fit in with millions and billions of years that scientists have determined. But I'm currently reading this book called Design Dissected by, it's not by Alistair Noble, but this is a foreword that Dr. Alistair Noble has written. It says, I'm not going to read all of it, but blindly defending the consensus is not how science and medicine advance, but rather by the hard-won acceptance of radical ideas which were originally dismissed with derision. Breakthroughs came from brave individuals who were willing to challenge the consensus with indisputable evidence for their case. I always say that it'll be the secular scientists that will prove Genesis, and they're doing it slowly, but we have to be patient, okay? One example is I kept hearing that limestone, and Professor McQueen touched on it a little bit, can't flocculate in high-velocity turbulent situations, e.g. a noble flood. Well, there was a recent paper that was written by secular geologists that dismissed that and say it can flocculate during fast-running water and turbulent waters. So all of a sudden they have to change their thinking. Okay, so this is what we normally say, the origin of nonsense, and it is. It's nonsense. And I always like to say, don't be deceived. Evolution is a lie. I have pens with that particular inscription on them, which I give away. Well, you heard that bit of a joke. The early bird catches the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. Okay, look, here's some proofs. Going back to languages, I'll touch on languages a bit later on, but you'll see there, this is Chinese, what do they call them, writing. So you can see there, Trinity plus person equals morally upright, plus tree, plus fuel equals Shang-Di. Now, Shang-Di, if you don't know, is also written simply as emperor, or is the Chinese term for supreme deity and the highest deity, e.g., aka God. There's another one. woman plus trees equals desire or covert. How do these people get all these that are so closely linked to what the Bible's saying? There's hands plus tree equals mulberry tree plus mouths equals to die, perish. I think we can all make the tie there, can't we? All right, person, or in other words, Adam plus serpent equals mourn. Chinese must have got that from somewhere. Person plus trees equal thorns. Another analogy to the Bible. Noble man plus disobedient equals rejoice. Kneeling man, take hold of. There's so much of the Bible in the Chinese inscriptions. It's unbelievable. Serpent plus trees equals negative, no, not. So we know that part of it as well. Now let's get into the actual flood itself. We hear that from many people that it was just a series of local floods. Well, here's a summary in a graph form of the events in the Bible. Okay, you'll see. Now, what local flood has ever produced 40 days and nights of continuous downpour? I'd like to know. And covers all the distant mountains and caused river rising waters for 150 days. There it is there in that particular one. Flooding for 314 days. So there it is there before the waters started to recede. And left the land unsafe and unstable for 57 days. That's from the time the waters begin to drain to the actual ground beginning to become dry, and they're able to leave the ark. Now, the geological evidence, as we said, there's an ascending phase. That is the first 150 days. We have the rapid formation of layers as shown by the fact that the things are fossilized before they could decompose or get scavenged. Ever seen fossil roadkill, for example? Now, sedimentary layers, I think Professor McQueen touched on this. You'll see that we find rock layers worldwide, and they've done chemical analysis of these rock layers to determine that they are the same rocks. For example, they can be traced all the way across continents, even between continents. I think Professor McQueen touched up on the limestone, but here's a particular a museum here, which shows the Cretaceous layer going across from Libya, North Africa to Israel. These are mega sequences. There's also the Salk sandstone, again, going from one continent to another. You've got the same thing, the geological column here, the Grand Canyon and the Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin. Here's some sonar studies. This was something that Dr. Steve Austin had undertaken at the Spirit Lakes. You can see there that those polystrate trees quite clearly at the base of the lake, and that there they are sinking to the bottom in that vertical position. You can do this test yourself, actually. You can get some matches, put them in a container or a beaker of water and let them sit there, and you'll see that after a while, some of them, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them will begin to sink to the bottom in that vertical position. Now, this is one of the things I like about when, I mean, I've read a lot of rescue devices for the polystrate trees, but I spoke to John Mackay a couple of times on this, and because he's considered an expert in coal, okay, and he's told me that they have found. Well, let's go through the secular explanation first. They believe that they believe that coal formed in swampy lands over millions of years. You know, forests grow, they fall over, a new forest grows, it falls over, etc., etc. But what he says, we have found a species of tree in a vertical position that doesn't grow in swamps. So their whole assumptions about this, it can be shot down just by one example, and that particular species, that particular polystrate tree that doesn't grow in swamps, is one of those pieces of evidences that you can shoot down the polystrate rescue devices. Also, I spoke to Ian Juby, and he's done a lot of work at the Joggin site in Canada. They found reeds, not trees, but reeds in a polystrate in a vertical position in the upside down position. Okay, so their rescue devices just don't work. I think that's it's a grasping of straws to save their deep time scenarios. So we can go like I've said here. It says hardly. Oops, sorry. I'm too quick with this this mouse. I gotta stop. Just bear with me. Sorry. Yeah, we can see from literal photographs that have exposed the cross sections of these geological hills and layers that there's hardly any time between the layers, as shown by the flat gaps, ephemeral markings, and the polystrate fossils, as we just mentioned. And here's a classic example. You look at those thin layers. I think John McQueen and Joseph Hubbard showed similar examples yesterday, where they actually cut through a creek bed and showed those particular fine layers of material. Now, according to secular geology, that occurred over millions, probably hundreds of thousands to millions of years. I mean, come on, guys, where's the erosion marks between those? And we'll show you later that some of the other evidence is that it just can't be explained by deep time. Okay, I'm a firm believer, as John is, that rock layers grow sideways, because I've seen them form. I've seen them in university flumes. I've seen them form in flumes that John and Joseph Hubbard have done in their Jurassic Ark in Queensland, and you can all see the videos of this as well. So just don't take my word for it. I mean, if you don't believe your own eyes, then I'm sorry, I can't help you. But I think John is correct that we need to pay him some copyright money for using the geological column term. I think it's really good. And of course, you go to other bits of information where you've got things like hundreds of millions of years of missing sediments. Okay, and even in the Grand Canyon, you can see there so many missing years of sediment, and you have to ask why. Why? There's another example of those thin layers. Here's something. Could there ever be only one type of material available for deposition in any environment for tens of millions of years? How could that be possible? Look at that, right? Why isn't it contaminated with other material? I mean, we spoke about the limestone, and limestone is deposited very slowly according to the secular geology explanation. If it took so many millions of years to deposit the limestone, why don't you find contamination or gradation of other materials in with the limestone? More evidence. I can keep going. Impact craters. This is fantastic. There are 110 impact craters in the fossil record, and you can see there where they're found. But the problem is, if you look at preceding layers below the surface, you don't find many. I don't think you find any, actually. So that's another piece of evidence. It goes back to my favorite subject of fossilized lightning, that e.g. the fulgurites. the Earth is 4.5 billion years, and there's been rain and lightning storms for most part of that, each layer should show some evidence of these fulgurites and there's quite a substantial number of lightning strikes on the surface, by the way. But we don't find that. When you look at the maths, it makes more sense that the Earth is young rather than billions of years old. Okay, so these are fantastic examples, like the bends in the rocks. John McQueen has demonstrated this in his flume experiments, where he can actually create a lot of these geological features that you see in textbooks in just 20 minutes in the flume experiments. And I'll show you a short video which he actually showed yesterday, which demonstrates that. Look at these layers here. That's amazing. There's no way that could happen in a deep time scenario without substantial cracking through those layers. Their explanation is the only way that can occur is if it's deep underground under pressure and great amounts of heat with lateral pressures which would bend those ductile materials without fracture. Well, there is no fracture, and if you look at the depths that this would have to occur, you'd have to ask why is the erosion so immense, and it doesn't fit their own erosion rates, by the way, because under their own erosion rates of 6 centimeters per 1,000 years, the entire Earth's dry landscape would erode down to sea level in just 10 to 12 million years. Okay, here's some more examples. Try and explain that one to a young Earth creationist that was formed because of ductile and ductility and lateral forces deep underground. That's ridiculous. You look at that formation there, followed by the laminar layers above it. I think you guys, if you saw yesterday's presentation by John McQueen, he actually showed this rotary flume where he actually created some of the landscapes that we're all familiar with at the Grand Canyon, with the layering, by the way, the layering and the landscape. Here's some of those examples that I mentioned. These are flume experiments. Okay, these are real life experiments that you can watch form yourself. Here they are again. It doesn't take millions and billions of years for those layers to form. Look at that, and that. This is a part where John simulated the Bible's claim that the depths, the waters of the deep, broke open, and he actually had water coming through that particular point that created that specific feature. There you go. Yes, that fracture straight line was caused by water, not by earth cracking. And here's some more examples of some of those flume experiments where you can see anticlines and synclines forming within 20 minutes, and they're formed parallel to the current, by the way. So no, it doesn't take millions of years with lateral pressures, etc. And there's a classic comparison of what John had done and what the textbooks actually illustrate. Again, the same thing in anticlines and synclines, not due to subsidence or uplift, but just the fact that the water flows in various situations like that. There are lots of variables, by the way, in water. There's quantity, there's velocity, changes in velocity, etc. So a lot can happen with those parameters changing. The Pete sandstone, I think I've mentioned this before, where we see these 90-degree bends. The secular explanation is that, and of course the recumbent folds in the coconut and sandstone, which the secular geologists claim that these occur in a Aeolian situation, that is wind deposition. That can't happen in wind deposition. That can only happen in water, as you saw previously in those flume experiments. That is a water deposition. But going back to this sandstone, we have now rebuked or rebutted the secular explanation that this occurred, deep in the earth. We're under heat and pressure with lateral compression causing those bends, because we've done tests on the particles themselves, and there's no crystallization, there's no metamorphosis. Metamorphic process you'd expect in heat type situations, and there is none. So that can now only happen by one process, and that is a water deposition with those layers being bent while they were still moist. Okay, the other one, this is the Grand Teton National Park. Also, you'll see it at the Himalayas as well. The thing I'd like you to notice here is the sharp edges along these ridges. If the Earth is billions of years, and the amount of erosion that has occurred during that period, you'd expect these sharp edges to have rounded and probably even disappeared, to be honest. But that's another piece of evidence. And this is my prediction. Just like junk DNA, the evolutionists the geologists will end up with egg on their face when some of these evidences are actually shown. I don't know whether they'll show them because it's too embarrassing for them. I'm not sure if the schools will actually provide these answers to the students, but we need to spread this information out there so they're aware of them. Okay, this is the Texas shooter fallacy. I always equate this to the evolutionists. Okay, they always come back and say things like, it was expected, right? If you know anything about the Texas shooter fallacy, is you shoot all these bullets and they're all over the place, and you come along and you draw the target afterwards and you say, you see, I was right. So there you go. Okay, fulgurites, fossilized lightning. I think I've said quite a bit about the fulgurites. These form during lightning storms, and if you check our previous streams on fulgurites, you'll see why it's almost impossible to get a deep time scenario with these formations. We don't find any in the preceding layers at all. So that's all I wanted to say there. And by the way, these lightning strikes travel deep into the ground, even through rock layers. There's a series of them along the coast. Obviously, that's had a battering of lightning storms that have hit that coast. Okay, the recessive phase. How am I going, Donny? Am I going too fast, or am I at the 20-minute mark?
You're doing great, brother. Loving the slides, loving the evidence.
Okay.
I don't want it to be overly strict for you. So whenever you feel you want to take a few audience questions, you just let me know.
I've got lots to present, so I'll keep going until you stop me. Okay. Now, this is something that is what you can see here. The Professor Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast has drawn this illustration of the extent of the Australian continent, 120 with the ocean waters at 120 meters below. Now, I'm going to show you another one here, and this is from NASA. Okay, and you can clearly see the connection between the continents. All right, you can see France and England connected. You can see Australia is connected to Indonesia and Vietnam. You can see Alaska is connected to the Siberian Peninsula. And here's this is secular information. Those of you that follow the subject of climate change, you'll see this particular graph which shows the change in sea level post-glacial, right? So you can see that the water levels were over 120 meters below the current levels, and that's what these diagrams actually show, 120 meters. So when people tell you that how did the kangaroos get to Australia? Well, they walked there, or in the case of the kangaroo, they skipped there. Okay, these plateaus, right? These are hard for evolutionists to explain. The plateaus can only occur through erosion, and Donny will remember we had Mike Ord about a month ago, I believe, where he actually presented some further information on ocean sediments. And they've done some studies now. We're calculating the volume of the sediments in the oceans, and they have determined that there would have been at least 1,900 meters, that's 1.9 kilometers, of material washed off the surface. There's your evidence. Okay, those plateaus. Okay, so this is Grand Canyon again. Classic example. I think Grand Canyon is a great example to show some of the erroneous assumptions of some of these secular geologists. They want you to believe, right, that the Grand Canyon rock took 5 to 6 million years of thousands. And by the way, in some cases, they estimate it's between 5 to 70 million years. So I've taken the smaller figure there. Thousands of feet of erosion to form the canyon. However, you have 10 and 20 million years of missing layers. A bit hard to swallow, that story, don't you think, when they say it took the Grand Canyon 5 to 6 million years to form, and yet on the same breath, they say that there are 10 and 20 million years of missing layers. That's just, sorry, doesn't work. And of course, we mentioned this again yesterday on yesterday's stream about the Grand Canyons, the ignorance of Bill Nye and many other evolutionists that I've had conversations with on the comments sections about why don't we find any canyons in other parts of the world? Well, you do. You just have to bloody, pardon the language, just Google. Even the ever reliable Wikipedia will tell you that that was sarcasm, by the way. It will tell you that there are numerous canyons all over the world, as you can see there. Okay, so I don't know what they're talking about, because actually the largest one is the Yalung Zangabao Grand Canyon in Tibet. Okay, it's 500 kilometers long, which is bigger than the Grand Canyon at 447. So now look at this. It says geologists debate the age of the Grand Canyon itself. These are not my words. It may be between 5 million to 70 million years old. Now, you'd think with all the dating methods that they themselves corroborate themselves, they could agree on an age that has a 1,400% variance. That's huge. Where's the corroborance of the dating methods to show the age of the Grand Canyon? Why do you have 5 million to 70 million years when you argue that all your dating methods corroborate each other? Nonsense. Okay, Psalms says the mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. Here's an entire continent, the continent of Zealandia. I brought this up yesterday at the presentation with John. You have a look at this. This Zealandia continent is bigger than Australia, yet it's sunk. Why is it sunk deep under the ocean? Well, the Bible talks about the waters of the deep coming to the surface. Well, imagine if the waters of the deep were contained below the ocean crust, then obviously if the water has come up, there's a void there, and once there's a void, there's nothing holding it up. It's everything above it will then sink. Hence, this particular continent of Zealandia, you can see there, has sunken down, where 94% of it is actually underwater, and you can only see there the remnants of New Caledonia and the islands of New Zealand in the south. Okay, that's another piece of evidence. Here's another one. Now, John, in the Flume experiments, has demonstrated this: the anticlines and synclines. In this particular case, entire mountains of anticline and synclines. Come on, guys, please open your eyes. That's what I said about you just have to open your eyes and see. How could these features occur in a deep time scenario? Look at the layering. Look at the smooth layering. That can only happen through a moist situation where lateral compression has forced these mountains and folded them in the manner that that you find them, with receding waters then carving out these valleys, and hence you get those rivers forming, rivers and creeks. We see it at Mount St. Helens. The Grand Canyon is another example. The river didn't carve that canyon. There's no way that river could have carved the canyon. I mean, you've all heard the arguments about the levels of the canyon, so I'm not going to go through all that. I think it's pretty evident. Another piece of evidence: the flood traditions. Hundreds. I think there's 270 or 300 flood traditions that have been identified, and you can see some of this criteria that we've gone through, and we've tabled it, and look at some of the similarities. The 95% of it, those flood traditions talk about a global flood. 70% say the survival was due to a boat. 66% was due to wickedness of man. Was there a favored family? 88%. 66% was the remnant forewarned? Yes. Bible talks about all these things. Did animals play any part? 71%. Did the survivors end up on the mountain? 57%. Were birds sent out? 35%. So there's a lot of information that you can find, and you can do your own research on this. And if you like, there's some of the references that you can check yourself. But I find some of the explanations of the secular people, the evolutionists, that come up with the Genesis flood story was a plagiarization of the Gilgamesh epic. Well, secular scientists, just let me finish this point, then I'll stop
no
there.
problem. Go ahead.
Secular scientists also say that the Aboriginals are the oldest culture on Earth at 40 to 60,000 years. They have flood stories. So if that explanation is valid for them to use, then can you make the connection that the Gilgamesh story was actually a plagiarization of the Aboriginal flood story, because theirs is a lot earlier than theirs. So that I'll finish there, Donny, and I'll go into the next one in the next section. Okay. All right.
Great. Yeah, George, great stuff. One comment perfectly sums that up. There we go. Anton says, this is mind-blowing me right now. So, it's precisely why I say it's 2022, and it is a great time to be a young Earth creationist. So great job so far, George and Professor McQueen. Go ahead.
Donnie, before we go to the first question, let me help George with his American pronunciation of the French. The Grand Teton National Park, those mountains you showed, your point's very well taken, that they should have been eroded in the past. But when the pioneers got there, having been away from their wives for so long, I wonder why they called it in French Le Grand Teton. It turns out I think Teton means breast in French. How is your French? Okay, Donnie, let's go with the first question.
and
Good
and,
stuff,
and
brother.
those mountains too. I think their own secular geology papers even state this. Even the hardest rock mountains would erode down to nothing in 42 million years. So it's just one thing I'd like to say is, look, I come from I guess a fairly well educated position. I never heard any of these arguments while I went through high school and even university. It really took me, the interest for me to actually research some of this stuff and find out that why aren't we being told about all this information, all this evidence that exists out
Right.
there? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's
good
a good
point.
that's a good point. Okay, so first question that comes in, and George, to what you just said, that's why we find hosting these types of comprehensive conferences so important, especially for people who haven't heard these lines of evidence before, because it's a great way to convert, bring people to Christ. So here we go. Question from Alan. Alan, $10 super chat. I do appreciate the support for this conference and for this ministry. So God bless. Question is, during the flood, how much distance do you think the ark traveled? My thinking is because the ark's dimensions were meant to float, ark wouldn't go far from the starting point. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Let me let George rest his voice for
Okay, thank you.
60 seconds, and I'll respond to that. Remember that the thing that Alan points out here is absolutely true, in the sense that if you look at Genesis 6, 7, and 8, the ark is essentially a Mississippi River barge. It's intended to be very stable. Now, how much distance could it have gone? The biblical ark, the way that it's described in Genesis 6, 7, and 8, Adam and his sons and their wives, the 8 people on board the ark, had no rudder. They had no ability to change the angle of the ark. And so the ark truly does become an example of God's grace, in the sense that God himself ordained where it went. Now, keep in mind that the fountains of the great deep are erupting during this time. And so God, through the Holy Spirit, I'm sure, moved the ark all over its point. I'm not speaking clearly. I don't think the ark remained above where it started. In other words, it's not as if it floated up and stayed there for the waters rising and then receding. But rather, I think that the ark was moved by the Holy Spirit into positions of safety. Now, theologically, this exactly fits in to the idea that the ark is symbolic of the Lord Jesus. The ark moved to keep it out of danger with the hand of the Holy Spirit. What do you think, George?
Well, we've also found evidence of large ballast stones that could have been hung on the sides of the ark to stabilize it. But the point that, yes, the ark was actually made to float, not to sail through the water. And there would have been some movement. I don't think anyone can really say categorically how far the ark may have travelled. It may have travelled, and maybe with the motions of the waters, it may have travelled back. So it could have gone forward and back. We don't know, but there's evidence there that it was stable. Even university students in Korea, I think South Korea, have done the testing on the dimensions of the ark and found it to be the best proportioned shape for floating. Yeah.
Okay, Donnie, give us our next question there. We'll tackle it.
All right, great responses, gentlemen. This isn't a question, but Pure Aussie Gold is showing some love, showing some support for the conference. We do appreciate it. Lots of work, gets put into these. So God bless. And $20 super chat. He says, it's a beautiful spring day. Coffees all around. Glory to God. Black tea for Professor McQueen.
Yes, black tea.
I
Okay.
definitely agree.
Yep, we've got blue skies and sunny day out here. Pure Aussie Gold knows where I am.
Beautiful. Can't go wrong with that. So next question comes in from Praise I Am. Good question. Appreciate it. He asks, what does David say about cataclysmic occurrences that supposedly happened billions of years ago that account for oceanic fossils on mountain summits?
This is a question that I get at least once a month. And sadly, it goes back to some bad Bible teaching, I would guess, from 1930 all the way up through when Dr. Morris became very active in the 1970s. And the idea is this. If this is Mount Everest here, and I'm going to draw a cross section, if that's Mount Everest there, many Bible teachers had the idea, okay, the flood waters rose, and as they rose, dead snails and clams were stuck on the outside of Mount Everest. So when the floodwaters went down, and then in our last couple of centuries, when people climbed Mount Everest, they found these fossils sticking like this as an evidence of the Great Flood. Well, see, that's not the correct geologic way in flood geology to think about Mount Everest. This is the correct way. Mount Everest, at the end of the Great Flood and in the years after that, using the things that George has taught us tonight about soft sediment deformation, Mount Everest layers were once horizontal. And as the Indian subcontinent went up against the, and once again, let me be sure to put a tree here so that you know that this is a cross section. As Mount Everest was built as a mountain after the flood, the fossil-bearing rock layers were deformed along with the deformation of the mountain. And so when people have climbed Everest, they have found fossils in the area that I'll circle with this red marker here. And that's why they find fossils from the Great Flood on Mount Everest. This is a very common misunderstanding. Back to you, Donnie.
Very good. Thank you, Professor McQueen. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, the other point is, I think we've mentioned this many times. Dr. Baumgartner, if there are any other engineers in the chat, they'll know about what a finite element analysis is. But Dr. Baumgartner began with the Pangaea continent and literally drew finite element analysis, actually looking at specifics about the surface of structures. We subdivide them into smaller triangles, and we analyze each triangle to find out the actual physics of each one. And by doing that particular exercise, Dr. Baumgartner was able to predict the literal paths of all the continents, including India smashing into the Asian continent. And he even went as far as predicting the actual speed of these continents. And some of the speeds, I think, were 1 to 2 meters per second. That's quite fast. And as Donny has made the analogy before, it's like two cars traveling at 100 kilometers an hour in opposite directions. They hit at head-on collision. You expect both cars to literally go up in almost into an A shape or a lambda shape, whereas if it was going slower, you wouldn't get that. I mean, we've all seen collisions at traffic lights, for example, where the car was literally crawling, and you make the comparison. Two cars traveling at 100 kilometers an hour versus two cars traveling at 5 kilometers an hour. So,
and Bonnie, before we go to Lou's question, I want to elaborate on a couple of points that George made that are very important. People have joked with me over the years about my using what in America is marketed as Play-Doh, modeling clay, that is very, very soft. But it turns out George and I have talked about the compressive strength, the Young's modulus of a Play-Doh like this. And this is actually a very good analogy to the soft sediments that were involved in the flood.
yeah.
Now, I want to go on next.
Can you put that,
George?
Can,
Yes.
can we just answer that question that I was on before, Donny? I think it was Lou. Yeah, I think Lou. The answer to your question is both, because the Bible says the mountains rose and the valleys sank. We know that during the recession stage, when the waters began to recede, there would have been great erosion occurring. So the erosion effect would also have created mountains and hills, as well as the uplifting of some of those regions as well.
And Lou, a better way to say the first part of that, did the flood form the mountains? You can go to Dr. Baumgartner's work that George was talking about. It was catastrophic plate tectonics
Yeah.
that formed the mountains. Now, there were some mountains that came about after the waters receded, or even during the time of between creation and the flood, but these were probably volcanic mountains, and would there's another story about that. But let me go on back to George's very important point. You know, over and over again, George pointed out that in the Grand Canyon, you simply don't find every unit. Now, let's remember the two different ways to think about this. The traditional evolutionary view is carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvania. The work that we've been trying to memorize that Dr. Tim Clary has done is called sequence stratigraphy, where the Cambro-Ordovician is called the Salk. And we remember that by 6 troubled kangaroos attacked zebras today. The Salk, the Tippecanoe, Kaskatchewa, Absarica, Zuni, and Tejas. Tejas being the Spanish word for Texas. The Salk sequence rocks, the Cambro-Ordovician rocks, the Tapete shale, the Tapete sandstone, the Bright Angel shale, and so forth, are clearly in the Grand Canyon. But when you get up to Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, this is that missing millions of years. Now, as a traditionally trained geologist, how would I view that? I would say, well, George, the reason that the years can't be there is that the index fossils for the Devonian are not there. You don't find abundant fish fossils. The word Devonian comes from the United Kingdom, It actually comes from the Devonshire area of England, where you do find fish fossils. And so this matter of index fossils is critical from a traditional geology standpoint for understanding the missing layers that George outlined.
Yeah, I'll be touching up on some of those other evidences on the mega sequences in my second part, David. So I don't know, Donny, do you want me to go into the second part?
Let's do one final question. That way we get through all the super chats, and then the rest of the questions we'll wait for the second hour. So here's the last one for this round, gentlemen. And then I believe, if I understood the format correctly, we're going into the same structure that we did the first hour. David and then George.
Well, actually, out of respect for George's time, I want him to go first, not me, in the second hour, because I know he's got a lunch appointment. If it's Thursday for me, it must be Friday for George. So I actually will have to look up during the break what 90 East Ridge is. Do you know what that is, George? I don't know what he's talking about.
Yeah. There's a ridge, I think, between India and the coast of the eastern coast, Malaysia, or I can't remember what the country is, but what is it? It's a crack, literally, that comes off another crack at about perpendicular direction, and it's like it's a 90-degree north-south ridge. I think they call it 90 East Ridge. I don't know for what reason, but
during the break, I'll look that up. George, let me yield my time to you, and you can go first this time.
Yeah, I think with okay. Well, I'll share my screen just so that I can go through some of this other evidence that I want to present. At least we can say we've okay. I touched up on languages. You can see there again, Genesis 6:9, how it accounts for the flood of 8 people. The symbol for boat is vessel, 8 people. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but because I touched on it before, because you can see plenty of examples where language is actually synonymous to what the Bible's talking. Here's some of those rapid burial of the plants and animals that David was talking about at the Himalayas, but these I think are at the Andes. Massive clams, by the way, in the closed position. Okay, now I want to touch on graveyards. I think there was a question about why. I think there was one question there about why isn't it a multiple of multiple local floods rather than one global flood? Well, you can see there on those arrows are actually depicting where dinosaurs were found drowned in a drowned position in where forget the term now, where their necks are literally bent back. It's a classic death pose of drowning. But here's some of those examples of the death pose. Okay, and as you can see, this is from yesterday's presentation by Joe Hubbard. Research shows that these dinosaurs had to be buried within 3 minutes or they would never revert back to the natural pose. They would revert back to the natural pose. So there you go. So we keep saying it's not time, but process that does this. And if we keep going, there's a link there if you want to check it. But there are massive graveyards. The Dinosaur Peninsula. Look at this. It stretches almost from Mexico right through to Canada. The dinosaur graveyard, the Ashley beds in South Carolina. For those of you that don't know, read about it because it's very controversial. Apparently, they found human bones there and a lot of other animals that shouldn't have been in the same layer, and a very thin layer, by the way. If you look into it, Leave me a comment down the bottom, by the way, and I'll give you heaps of information on how it's impossible to get the range of fossils that they found in a effectively 8 thick layer. It's really ridiculous. And again, why do we get fossils? Well, if they're not buried quickly, there's a specific water mold, okay, that literally eats up the entire carcass of anything that's in the water. I think we even see whale carcasses at the base of the ocean where they've gone back a year later and they've been completely devoured, including the bones. Okay, you see the crabs come in, they start eating the flesh, and then right down to worms that come in and eat the bones. So the fossils have to be buried very quickly, otherwise they will not survive. And here's a study that's been done where they've looked at various fossils where they're found and tracks, and you can see the tracks are always found before the fossils. Tracks, fossils, tracks, bodies, tracks, bodies, and so on. And mega sequences. You can see how even the secular scientists say that the continents were covered by water. They won't go to the extent of saying that it was a global flood, but you can see that there's evidence there of catastrophism, and you can see there we find extensive fossil graveyards and exquisitely preserved fossils. For example, billions of nautiloid fossils are found in a layer within the Redwall limestone of Grand Canyon. If you look at there's one where Kurt Wise is showing the outline of the nautiloid. Obviously, the rest of it's been eroded to that plane, the surface. There's another one. That's a nautiloid. And as you can see, there's nautiloids everywhere. I believe, as you can see, the extent of the area. I forget the size of that area, but there's a link if you want to go, and I've given you a timestamp to check it out yourselves. So there they are again. There's an nautiloid. There's some references. Oops. There's some references there. And of course, sedimentary layers. I mentioned it earlier. 75% of the continents are covered with sedimentary lock layers. The word itself, sedimentary, means water or wind deposition. We claim that it's water because there's evidence that shows that it can only be water. As I showed you with the Coconino sandstone, the recumbent folds. Also, we get to Steve Austin and the Mount St. Helens. This is a real life example, guys, where the eruption and the melting of the snow on the cap literally eroded all the sediments off the mountain and deposited them down further down the valley. But you see some of these mega sequences, like the Tapete sandstone that we mentioned earlier with the 9-degree bends. Look at the size of that, right? And they've done studies on the actual chemical composition of these grains of sand, and they found that it actually extends far more than just the American continent. It goes straight through, as you can see there, through most of the world. And here are some of those global mega sequences that Professor McQueen was talking about: the Soak, the Kaskaskia, the Tippecanoe, massive mega sequences, guys. And here's I'm going to go through some series of screenshots here where you can see even the direction of the flows of some of these mega sequences: Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Mississippian, the Pennsylvanian, the Permian, the Triassic, the Cretaceous, There's a Tapete sandstone again, equivalent across North Africa and the Middle East. Even with, I think Professor McQueen touched up on the limestone, where you can see evidence of it at Dover in England, right across through Europe, through the Middle East, and going through to the Americas. So, a rapid or no erosion between strata. We spoke about that in some of those photos of the Grand Canyon and many other examples of mountains with those very thin lines between successive layers. I mean, you can argue that they were laid one by one, but because we've just shown you that these mega sequences can't be local floods, guys. Come on. The thing I like about America is they have so much information on a lot of this stuff. I wish a lot of this kind of analysis can be done across the world, and I think we're slowly doing it. But it takes money, and we don't have access to billions of dollars of government grants that secular science has. So many strata are laid down in rapid succession. We mentioned those mega sequences and whatever upstairs. Previously in the presentation. Geologists have determined early Earth was a water world by studying exposed ocean crust. Now, even they have to admit that the Earth was literally covered in water. There's some more references you can check on that. And, of course, the catastrophic plate tectonics, my favourite subject. I love this one. You can see there's a analysis of one of those coal subduction plates. As you can see, it's deep down into the mantle, going down 700 kilometres, not metres, kilometres. Okay, I've done some convection calculations on this, and you'd expect that that coal subduction layer to have reached thermal equilibrium to the surrounding mantle material within 29,000 years to 290,000 years, depending on your assumptions. So why are they cold? If that particular subduction plate has been there for a considerable amount of time, and I'll give you an example. Based on the tectonic plate movements at the Hawaiian Islands, I think they've been measured by satellites at 75 millimeters per year. You equate that to the 700 kilometers, you get around 10 million years. So this plate has been subducting for 10 million years, okay, and it hasn't reached thermal equilibrium. You'd see that particular blue band there changing color, gradually changing color, if it was there for 10 million years. So, sorry, the secular explanation doesn't work. And if you think it's an isolated case, I think, again, this is NASA, right? They're finding these coal subduction regions pretty much everywhere they look under the mantle. Okay, so I mentioned that. Tectonic plate movements, as I said with Dr. Baumgartner's final elemental analysis, still has not been refuted. No secular geologist or geophysicist that I know of has actually refuted this. I've read one paper that attempted to explain it, and if you read it with an open mind, you'll see the number of assumptions and speculation that they introduce into that paper. It's laughable, really. It's laughable, and I can't imagine how it got through a peer review process. I keep saying peer review means nothing. It just means that someone who agrees with you has approved it. Nothing. The connection of the continents we mentioned earlier. And here are some of those ridges. Unfortunately, I haven't got that particular 90 degree bend, ridge, east ridge that was mentioned in the question. I think it's somewhere around here, David. See where India is?
I actually took my break and looked up what he was talking about. So when you reach a break point, I'm ready to
Yeah, well,
respond to that?
I'm just about to finish. You can see there with Steve Austin's. Steve Austin is a scuba diver like myself, and he's actually taken these photographs. This is Spirit Lake, where you can actually see the logs in the vertical position, and you saw previously from that sonar image how they've been buried in that position as well. So the next one, I think Donny is aware of this, is the genetics. Evidence from genealogy. I mean, there's so much about this. You look at the three wives and over. This is the haplogroups that Donny has used quite a few times. Those three nodes, how could they be? They're analogous to the three wives of Noah's sons. This is genealogy. This is genetics that's doing this, right? So there's another piece of evidence that points back to the flood. And of course, the biblical lifespans going back to creation right down through to today. And most people are aware that the Bible is written over 1,500 years. I think it's got 40 authors or so. I think it's 40. And these ages are mentioned in the Bible. So and so beget so and so beget so and so, etc. And when they died, and if you produced a statistical analysis graph like that, I'll tell you now, I did a whole year of statistical analysis at university level. If we find a best fit that's over 0.95, that is considered a very accurate fit. My point here is, how can 40 different authors over 1,500 years collude to get a statistical analysis that accurate? Sorry, it just can't happen. It's impossible. So you can see there's another one where it talks about 95 reasons why the Genesis flood was global. I think, that's the end of my presentation, Donny. I'm sorry I had to sort of fly through a lot of that, but I have to probably leave in about 10 minutes. But hopefully that was eye-opening for people.
Yeah, and
George.
Yep.
because
Actually, if I could, Professor McQueen,
yeah,
since George is leaving at the hour and 45-minute mark, can I get one question in that came specifically for you, George, in the form of a clarifying question based on something you said earlier on the Grand Canyon? So since we have 10 more minutes with you, by the way, fantastic information. It's hard to believe that we've already been doing this for an hour and a half, this session, that is. So great job, gentlemen. So here's a question. Let me put it up on screen so you can read it. And lots of good questions coming in from the audience. So I do want to thank the audience. As always, you guys have been awesome during this conference. So many good questions. Okay, so a question for George. How do you use dating methods to determine when the Grand Canyon was eroded? I think this goes back to an argument you made in your first portion there. Are dating methods useful in telling us when the canyon was eroded?
Well, that's just it. I keep saying the Grand Canyon is made up of predominantly sedimentary layers, and you can't date sedimentary layers. It's almost impossible. At least you can't date them accurately. So, but it's their claim, not mine. They claim that they can date things, and unfortunately, we've done lots of research on the dating of the canyon by dating the Cardenas and the what's the other one, David? The I think it's the Eukaryote lava flow, where there
are several lava flows. Some of the Indian names are hard for me to pronounce.
Yeah. Well, they've dated those lava flows wildly different ages using the different dating methods, and they found some variances that run into like the thousands of percent variance, and guess what? They have found Indian artifacts in those lava flows. We know that the Indians weren't there like millions of years ago.
Right.
So their own dating methods disprove themselves. As I said about the claim that requires dating to find fossil fuels, total baloney. Even the oil exploration firms, if you watch their videos, not once do they mention dating of rocks. Not once. They use predominantly seismic reflection studies to do that analysis, and that because it's very expensive to drill through rock layers, 1 to 2 kilometers depth, and then find out, oops, there's nothing here. Let's go to the next location. So, yeah, going back to the question, it's the secular scientists that claim it's 5 million to 70 million. Well, come on, if you reckon your dating methods are accurate, then show us a variance that's not 1,400%. I hope that sort of clarified it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, George. Professor McQueen, I understand you wanted to make a couple points as well.
Yeah, a couple of comments, but if George has to leave soon, you've been kind over the last year to allow us to have a 5-minute kind of summary. George, if you want to do that now, you go right ahead, my brother.
Oh, I can hang around for another 5 minutes, David.
Okay, no problem. Here's my comment on this. Let's go back to the 90-degree east question. During my break, I went and looked it up, and it turns out that's a reference to 9 degrees east longitude. I went into my library and found my globe, and George is quite right that 9 degrees east longitude comes south through Bangladesh and Western China. It doesn't touch India at all, but it goes to the west of Sumatra and to the west of Thailand. And the reason that the geological community is interested in this line is that there is a line of geologic activity that parallels it. Now, in the time we have tonight, we don't have time to go through the names of the igneous rocks that are found on the ocean basin. But the argument revolves around complex igneous rock types. And the idea of this is that, what can I use to illustrate? Let's do it this way. I'll tear my Play-Doh in half, and the line in between it, I'll use this washcloth here as an example. Let's imagine the washcloth to be the 90-degree east longitude. And as you go down, you divide the basin that is near this longitude into two parts. There's an eastern part closer to the islands, and then there's the western part that goes out into the Indian Ocean. Well, if I push these two things together and wrap some of this pink away, the argument is revolving around that pink layer in between. And the evolutionary geologic argument is that over 50, 60 million years, there's been a hot spot underneath here. And as the continents have moved, and as this plate has moved, it has recorded in these rocks evidence of the movement. Now, using catastrophic plate tectonics and using the work of Dr. Baumgartner, we don't doubt that there is a interesting geological feature around 90 degrees east longitude. But we would argue that it developed and the rock types developed very quickly. Now, the bottom line, or the second part of this whole argument, has to do with something that George and I have spoken on more than one occasion about, and that is the issue of the accuracy of radiometric dating. In the early 1970s, I worked at Oak Ridge National Labs for Dr. Bob Gentry, who's now passed away, and worked with him on radioactive halos. The issue of radioactive halos is for another day, but the radioactive halos are zones of discoloration in micas and biotites, or rather in biotites and fluorites and so forth. And these zones of discoloration are concentric. And the fact that they are concentric around a zircon, and they truly are circles, not ellipses, allows you to measure the distance to each one of these rings. Now, why would that be important? One of the rings is U-238. One of the rings is polonium. It'd be PO-210. The diameter of these rings are proportional to the radioactive decay rate. If you go throughout the geologic column and you look at supposed intrusives and others, you should be able to prove that the radioactive decay rate has been constant with time. Bob Gentry's work, which you can find in some of my footnotes in the past, maybe Donnie will put one even here. Bob Gentry's work shows that statistically, the radioactive decay rate at most has significant errors. And if you take the most conservative view of nuclear physics, it says nothing about radioactive decay rate, or proves it wrong, as a young Earth creationist would put it. So that would be my summary, George, before you go.
Yeah, thanks. Just on time, actually. So I'm sorry, but I'll catch the rest of the presentation after I get back watching the replay. I hope I provided enough information there to really justify our belief in the global flood.
Oh yes,
and as I said, I'm surprised that the education system doesn't actually bring in some of these arguments only from a critical thinking point of view. I mean, I remember when I was in university, one of the things that our teachers taught us to do was to critically think.
Yes.
Yet we're not presented some of this information at the lower levels, at the high school levels.
Yeah.
And that's disturbing to me. And because I have a daughter that has a master's in biological science. And when I talk to her about some of this genealogical stuff and the genetics, she shakes her head. She says, "No, we were never taught about soft tissues surviving 65 million years." Stuff like that. She doesn't know anything about the haplogroups, none of the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome studies. So you just wonder what they're being told.
And see, one wonderful thing about Standing for Truth is that people can go back and look at these videos. And one thing that's come out of this week is Donnie's idea to pray that God would raise up the money, that this whole series could be put on DVD. And then a teacher could go to a piece of what Dr. Bergman said, go to a piece about the genetic argument, and then come and look at our flood geology argument. I hope people raise that money up for you, Donnie. That'd be a good idea, wouldn't it?
Mm. Anyway, I'll say goodbye now. God bless everyone, and I'll see you when I see you.
Okay,
Yes,
God
George.
bless, George. Fantastic work. Appreciate it. That was nearly 2 hours of just nonstop evidence for the global flood. So God bless you, George. Enjoy your pizza.
I'll have a
You've
pizza and a
definitely
beer
earned
for
it.
you too, Donnie. Okay. I'll wait
Make
for
it
you.
a non-alcoholic one.
See you, David.
See ya.
Bye.
Donnie, what I'd like to do is take some more questions, and then I'd like you to block off 5 minutes at the end, because I'd like to give, I've had quite a journey in the last 2 months of sickness, and have been taught by the Holy Spirit, I think, some things. And so at the end, I'd like 5 minutes to summarize that. Let's go ahead to the next question.
Okay. All right. That sounds great, David. So Stephen Tibbetts, who I seem to never be able to pronounce your last name correctly, Stephen. So hopefully that time I did. Question for McQueen. How many cans of Play-Doh would it take to demonstrate all the layers in the geologic column?
Okay, let's count it out on our fingers, brother Stephen. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, that's 10. And then when you get past the Cretaceous, this whole argument about is that when the flood ended or not? Well, when you go on up into what's called the Tertiary and Quaternary, you would add at least 2 more. And if you wanted to try to simulate Eocene, Paleocene, and all the other divisions, why don't you send Donnie enough money for maybe 40 cans of Play-Doh?
Awesome. Love it. Okay. Well, appreciate that. Okay. So question comes in from Cool Jesus. Cool Jesus, thank you so much. Always with good questions. And okay, so here's the question. During the flood, was there standing water all across the globe? Or were there intervals of dry land and then water rushed over the land? Were the continental plates moving underwater or above?
Okay, let me erase the board. Is there some glare in this area, but you can still read down in this area, Donnie?
Oh, yeah, I can still, a little bit of glare, but I can still read it. Brother.
Okay, let me erase this and use the bottom part of the board, because this is an important issue. The quick answer to the second part of that question is that the catastrophic plate tectonics is happening underneath the water. Now, let's be sure that we clearly remember what the Bible teaches, that the waters rose over a 6-month period, and that gets us up to Genesis 8, verse 1, and then the waters receded, so for an additional 6 months. When my wife and I teach children, we point out to them that everybody had a birthday on board the ark. So the overall process was more than 365 days. And so when we look at the model that I've been working on for several decades, you have a one world continent that's in the shape of a C. So this would be north. And this would be the way that the continent looked when the flood began. I have no idea where Noah's Ark was built, and I challenge both theologically and also archaeologically, geologically. I don't think anybody knows where the ark was built. Could it have been down here or up here or over here? No one knows where it was built. But to help people conceptualize things, what I've done over the years is I've tried to imagine where Eden was. And since in our modern world, most people live within a 1-hour drive of the beach, I would imagine that the most heavily populated areas of this one world continent would be the coastal areas. Why would that be important? My mentor, Dr. Henry Morris, estimated there might have been 1 billion people alive at the beginning of the flood. Another researcher writes under the name John Wood-Moraphy. Jan Petchkus is his name. He's been a guest in my house. We've talked for a long time. John Wood-Moraphy thinks that there might have been 100 million people alive. Well, whether it's 1 billion or 100 million, that's a lot of people in this area here. Now, why have I left a gap right in this area? If you're aware of the geologic vocabulary for Pangea, this would be called the Tethys Sea, the words Gondwana land, and so forth, could be applied to the other parts. But if this area here that I've drawn in the triangle is the area where Eden was, then we can talk about some interesting things. Through Adam and Eve and through Adam's testimony, we know that there were rivers that flowed from an upland area, probably in this area. And let me use a different color and a different symbol. Let me use this symbol to illustrate mountainous areas. So these rivers ran down to the ocean the same way they do today. And that is where we find in Genesis a reference to rivers that have headwaters. Some of these words are the same we see today. And therein lies an interesting point. I don't think we can ever find exactly where these rivers were. But as the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth moved around the world, they named certain areas from what they had determined in the Bible. So they saw a river valley that reminded them of the Tigris Euphrates. So one of them got a name of that. When my great-great-grandfather came over from Scotland in 1820, he moved to North Carolina. Why? Because aspects of North Carolina's geography and geology reminded him probably of the highlands that are northwest of Glasgow. And so there's a lot of things that are going on. But now on to your question. When the worldwide flood happened and this broke up, you've got continental masses, and I think you can still see it if I come down here. You've got areas, for example, like Australia right here, maybe South America began moving this way, North America. Some of this became Europe and India. And this modern thing we've been talking about, the 90 degrees east longitude might be there. Let me take a sip of water here. And so as these continental masses were moving, they were colliding, producing the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. It is probably the case that all of the Alps were not built in that last 6 months. And after the time of the flood, we have a time of residual catastrophe. So, having said all that, the answer to your question is yes. As the year-long flood went, there were parts of, let's say, the western United States that had an inland sea that went up. If the Plato can is around Memphis, Tennessee, this is Memphis, and you go out west of Memphis to Texas and all the way up into Canada, there was probably an ocean there, and we find a lot of dinosaur trackways associated with that area. And so, what do we know biblically? What must be true biblically is that by the time by the time Noah and his family got off the ark, what had to be true? Every human was judged by God and was dead. And then secondly, every animal that was not on board the ark was dead, with the exception, of course, of fish and mosasaurs and other creatures that could have lived during that time. Do you find that answer helpful, Donnie?
Definitely. Very thorough, Professor McQueen. I always appreciate the visuals, the diagrams. So that was very helpful. I do appreciate that. Professor McQueen, we'll go right to the next question then. You're doing a great job. So this comes in from Doki Doki Bible Club. And Doki has a question. And the question is, how does Professor David McQueen and George answer the geologist who says a catastrophe here and there is no problem in the old Earth model? So if I could reword that a little bit, it sounds like he's pointing to the old Earth argument that says, well, yeah, over here we've had a catastrophe, a local catastrophe, but that doesn't mean there was a worldwide catastrophe. Go ahead, David.
Right. And the way that your Bible club in the future should answer teachers that say this, yes, there were local catastrophes. And I understand as a young Earth creationist that in your old Earth model, you have no problems with local catastrophes. But as you teach the Bible club, remember that there are now 3 points of view that are being held. There is the traditional, all this is wrong, and old Earth evolutionary geology is true. There's a compromise position that is being put out there now that is called old Earth creationism. And then my point of view and the point of view of Standing for Truth is young Earth creationism. And so let's go to the compromise position of old Earth evolutionists. They will say, okay, McQueen, we don't have any problem with a local flood sometime in the last billion years, burying the Green River fish fossils out in the western United States. We don't have any problem with the local catastrophe, burying a bunch of dinosaurs in Australia or burying Archaeopteryx in Europe. We don't have any problem with that. But how can you put it together into a global flood? The point they're missing, and the way I would answer it, is if you get all 10 of my grandchildren at Christmas time running through my house, I see the oldest teenager run through and knock something over. That's a local catastrophe. And then the baby of the family actually knocks the complete Christmas tree over. Well, that's a big time Ms. McQueen catastrophe there. If I look at these 10 isolated catastrophes, I can see them happening sequentially during the time of a year-long flood. My problem is that if an evolutionary scientist were to come into my house and see the broken pot here and the overturned Christmas tree there, he might try to say, oh, these are 10 isolated local catastrophe, but Christmas still lasted a week, didn't it? I hope you find that analogy helpful.
Yes, I love it. Always very helpful. Okay, let me sneak this one in here too. Question from Stephen. Stephen asks, question for both, but we'll have to answer for George. But good thing you and George are very like-minded, Brother McQueen. So question is, how much credence do you give to the theory that after the flood buried everything in the low-lying seas, that the land sunk and the old seas uplifted?
That question, Stephen, ties in very nicely with the history of flood geology. You have to remember that Dr. Whitcomb and Dr. Morris worked on the defining book, The Genesis Flood, all through the 1950s. Dr. Morris's children have told me about how every family vacation, either the Morris family went to Indiana to be with Dr. Whitcomb, or the Whitcomb family came to wherever the Morris family was, Louisiana, Texas, wherever they were, VPI, to work on the book. And so when those men were reading the geology books in the 50s, plate tectonics was not on the horizon yet. There were some ideas about it, but the basic idea in the 1950s was that you had land masses which were responding to what the geophysicists called isostasy. And this is the idea that if you have a block of the Earth's crust that's quite heavy, it's going to go down. And as it goes down, the lighter areas are going to go up. But it gets even more interesting than that, because if you use the Play-Doh to create a soft layer, and then you make a syncline out of it, like this, like a smiley face, these were the years of the geosynclinal idea of sediments coming into large ocean basins and so forth. Okay, so Dr. Morris lived long enough, and Whitcomb did too, to understand that plate tectonics played a role. Well, if you go to Dr. Andrew Snelling's now 10-year-old big book on Earth's catastrophic past, that was the rewrite that Dr. Morris wanted done of the Genesis flood, incorporating modern geology ideas. Then if you go beyond Dr. Andrew Snelling's book up to the book that has taught us so much about sequence stratigraphy, when you go up to the big book of Tim Clary, he then pulls in all kinds of data from oil wells worldwide that documents this sequence stratigraphy. Let me see if I have memorized it well enough. So we've got 6. We got the Salk sequence first, and then it goes up through 6 other sequences, and then ends up in the Tejas at the top. And these are from the bottom to the top, Abserica, and all the rest that is getting too late for me to remember. Of course, I could read it from my secret list here. 6 troubled kangaroos attack zebras today. Salk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, Abserica, Zuni, and Tejas. So this is the modern flood geology replacement for Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian, and so forth. So that's the way I would answer that.
Well, I appreciate that, Professor McQueen. I do want to be cognizant and respectful of your time. We are over the 2-hour mark. Brother, did you want to go in?
let me take two more questions, and then I'd like to give my 5-minute summary.
Okay, perfect. Here we go. Next question comes, and as you know, Professor McQueen, we've always got endless questions from our awesome audience.
Well, that's good. We'll have to do a 100% Q&A in a couple of weeks.
Amen. And we still have over 80 people in the live chat enjoying session 8. You and George have done a fantastic job, David. So next question comes in from Pure Aussie Gold. Question: what does George and Professor McQueen think of the wave formation in Central Australia?
You know what? I have never been taught by John Mackay and George about this wave formation. So we'll save that for next time, Aussie Gold. Next one.
Okay, perfect. So next question comes in from right here. Jeremy McLeroy. Thank you for the question. I've heard there is some pre-flood rock visible for research. Is there anything it can tell us?
Well, I think the answer is yes. In the time before the flood, we know a couple of things for sure. There was igneous rock and metamorphic rock and sedimentary rock predominantly without fossils. Now, I've been using a teacher trick on you with this red rock here. It turns out that I looked at it in some detail, and if I take it up close to my camera, you'll notice that white area. Well, that it turns out is quartz, and this is actually an igneous rock with a boundary here. It's almost like igneous and sedimentary. It's much of what we might have expected to find in the pre-flood world. And so I will tell a story from my experience. In 2018 and 2019, I was invited to be a geologist as part of a missionary team that went to the country of Zimbabwe. Now, those of you that are as old as I am will remember that modern Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia in the past. The capital, Harare, that I flew into in the old days was called Salisbury. And you'll remember that there was quite an argument between the white government and the black Africans about the political future of this country, Zimbabwe. Well, being in Zimbabwe for almost a month and a half, separated by a year, certainly made me fall in love with Africa. I didn't understand why so many missionaries actually fall in love with the culture and the environment of Africa. Well, when I got to the Bible camp where we stayed, I noticed on the road there and on the road coming into the camp, actually, that there were enormous outcroppings of granites that were lining the road. And so I began to collect these granites from tens of kilometers away from downtown Harare to the actual church courtyard of one of the churches that we spoke at in the city of Harare. And to show you how the Holy Spirit works in people's lives, there was a certain type of rock called a pegmatite that I hadn't been able to find, or at least I didn't find it with big enough biotite crystals in it that I could do research like Bob Gentry taught me to look at the radioactive halos in it. And so during a break in the church service, I walked out into the courtyard and I noticed that around the big tree were exactly the kind of rocks I was looking for. So I didn't have to stumble through the jungle like Stanley and Livingston did back in those famous days. I didn't have to go down the Zambezi to Victoria Falls. It was right there in front of me. And I brought those rocks back and have begun doing research on them. Igneous rocks that would be called granites, especially those that have biatites in them, are a type of Creation Week rock that I think we can benefit from. Do you see my point there, Donnie?
I do, Professor McQueen. I do. I appreciate all the knowledge you have on this important technical topic. With that, we've gotten through a ton of questions. This has been another comprehensive session. Did we want to go into closing words, points, and thoughts?
Yeah, I would. And this is very personal to me because I have had kidney problems since the 1st of July and will be, I appreciate your prayers, will be having my 4th surgery this coming Tuesday. Compared to what I've been through, it's a minor matter. But nonetheless, I have been laid up during the last 2 months and have had quite a bit of time to think about what I was going to say tonight. And the Lord led me to the book of Job, not because I suffered as badly as him, but because of Job's friends. You may recall that when Satan was allowed to touch Job and Job's children and so forth, that our scripture points out that Job had a number of friends that came around him. One of his friends was named Elihu. And if you go and read from about Job 39, Job 36, all the way to the end, you'll see that God rebukes these friends because they told Job the wrong things. In other words, they said, Job, this has happened to you because of your own sinfulness. Well, no question that Job was a sinner. But at the end of the book, as God points out to Job Behemoth and Leviathan, he humbles Job by helping him to see that he's not God. He's not in control of all this. And of course, we know at the end, God made it up to Job, which is looking forward to heaven. And so I realize that in the Standing for Truth audience, I'm not the only person that's been under the weather in the last 2 months. But my encouragement would be to continue to put your focus on God. Now, why would this come into a discussion of flood geology? If George and I and the others can point out that Genesis 6, 7, and 8 can be trusted, if through the work of Donny and others, we can actually see that we can get the current population and get the current genetic structure, DNA, and all the rest, going back to just 2 people 6,000 years ago, then can you see that if you trust Genesis, then as you move to the New Testament, as the Lord Jesus points back over and over again to Genesis, you can also trust him. And so the focus for myself has been, how can I move closer to the Lord? Well, I'm not as close as I hope to be this time next year, but I would encourage you to go back, and if you've never done it, it would be handy to read with fresh eyes the first 12 chapters of Genesis, and then skip over to the book of John, and again with fresh eyes, read what it says there. Thank you, Donnie, for this opportunity for testimony.
Amen. Amen, Brother McQueen. As always, lots of love and plenty of prayers for you, Professor McQueen. I do appreciate those beautiful and very thoughtful final words. That is the perfect way to conclude session 8 with Professor David McQueen and George
And
Bond.
what I'm going to do, brother, is I'm going to go down and leave the studio, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
God
Bye-bye.
bless, brother. And God bless the audience. Thank you for sticking with us. We've still got 80 people in the chat. Please share around this content. The truth is important. And as I like to say, you know, we at Standing for Truth, we are just getting started. So that's a wrap of day 4. We've had 2 sessions, session 7 with Dr. Jerry Bergman here. Darwin's Frauds, Blunders, and Forgeries. That was from roughly 6 till 7:30. And then we just had Professor McQueen and George Bond give 2+ hours of just undeniable, irrefutable evidence for the Genesis flood. Day 3, we had myself, evolutionist favorite arguments debunked. I had some fun for 2 hours straight debunking nested hierarchies, homology, transitional forms, the fossil record in general, chromosome 2 fusion, endogenous retroviruses, pseudogenes, DNA level hierarchies, you know, the so-called similarities in DNA anatomy morphology between chimps and humans. And that really was a blast. We also had for day 3, this was, I believe, session 6, Dinosaurs and the Bible and the genealogic column. This was a fascinating presentation, 2.5 hours of just some really amazing information, updates on the creation research team and their flume experiments. Joseph Hubbard and John Mackay, the creation guy, 2 of my favorite young earth creationists, just a couple of geniuses doing some really phenomenal research. So definitely check that one out. Then, of course, day 2, we had Countering Compromise with CJ Cox. Matt N gave a 3+ hour, 2+ hour presentation. Then we did about an hour discussion on Genesis genetics. Day 1, we kicked off the conference with T-Rock on dating methods, the isochron method and other dating duds. And of course, Sal Jardina, our very first presentation for the week, the relevance of Genesis. And tomorrow, day 5, is our final day. Once this conference is complete, we would have probably had about 20+ hours worth of content for you. I would love to get this conference into a DVD collector's edition, I guess you could say. 20 hours worth of content, defending Genesis, evidence for separate ancestry creation, evidence against universal common ancestry, and deep time. Again, it really is a great time to be a young earth creationist. Tomorrow's day 5, our final day. We have 2 more sessions. So specifically, we have Matt Powell. He will be here at 5. So he'll be giving a presentation, Evidence for Creation. And then we're wrapping up this entire conference, this epic week of presentations, discussions, audience Q&A periods, refuting the critics. We're going to wrap it up with a debate. So, of course, the debate king himself, this will be his 301st debate. He's definitely setting records. Dr. Dino versus David Emery. The rematch. Is there reasonable evidence for macroevolution, which, if there is, would contradict the account of origins and ancestry in Genesis. So that will be our final session, session 10, and that will be tomorrow at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock Central. And last thing I want to mention, special creation, nearly 300 pages worth of content. describing the amazing evidence for separate ancestry, independent origins, a literal Adam and Eve. If you can see the awesome cover, Benjamin did another amazing job. He really is a blessing to this ministry. We've now, published over a dozen books, and I really am just thrilled with his artwork. He's very talented. So if you could see on the back of the book, you'll have topics covered such as mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, out of Africa versus out of Middle East, Neanderthals and human evolution, where I touch a great deal on Neanderthal phylogenetics in this book. You'll find some novel answers to the critics' favorite challenges and criticisms to the biblical model of ancestry, evolution versus devolution. I've got an incredibly comprehensive chapter on genetic entropy and genetic degeneration in this book. As a matter of fact, it's the length of the chapter. It could be its own handbook. That also goes for the chapter on Neanderthals, which I am going to start work on a Neanderthal handbook as well. Chromosome 2 fusion, of course, which I touched on in great detail during last night's session. And of course, endogenous retroviruses, but I do have an entire book out on endogenous retroviruses. So if that being, the number one evidence these days put forth or advanced by the evolutionary community, definitely. Here it is here. If you haven't yet picked up this book, please do. It's worth it. It's worth the read, and you'll be well equipped to take on the evolutionists and their, so-called best lines of evidence. So real quick, let me just look at the chat. And all right, thank you everybody for joining us. This was a ton of fun. Doki Doki Bible Club, thank you so much, brother. Yeah, so tomorrow Eastern time, session 9 with Matt, and then session 10. In my opinion, the perfect way to wrap up a conference, this specific conference at least, with a debate. And it'll be a very entertaining debate, I'm sure, between Kent and David Emery. So with that, we are going to wrap up day 4. This was, again, session 8, David McQueen and George Bond, amazing evidence for a worldwide flood. Actually, I want to get this in here before I forget. What we'll do sometime after the conference, so between probably Saturday and Wednesday of next week, Matt and myself, we will do a 2022 Defending Genesis Conference Aftermath program, where we will just come together for a couple hours. We will discuss some of the highlights of the conference. And since we've had hours worth of audience Q&A, and yet still many questions that we haven't had the time or opportunity to get to, what we'll do is just kind of open it up during that time as well for straight audience questions. So if there are questions that you ask during the conference, especially during Matt and my sessions, then just make sure to send those questions in during that aftermath show or after show to the Defending Genesis conference, and we'll do our best to answer them. So we're doing a lot, guys. The party's just getting started. And again, thank you so much for tuning in, Iron Matt. Appreciate that. I thought that would be fun. And okay. All right. God bless everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Tons of fun, tons of information. Share this content around. The truth is important. Critical thinking is important. And we will see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock EST. God bless.